Hello, everyone. Welcome back from lunch and from Glimpse. I got to connect with Martin and Alex, which was amazing. And I'm completely honored to introduce our next speaker, Renee DiResta. And Renee is the Technical Research Manager at Stanford's Internet Observatory, where she researches influence operations and computational propaganda in the context of pseudoscience, conspiracies, terrorist activity, and state-sponsored information warfare. So without further ado, Renee will take the floor.
Hi, it's great to be here today. I think my understanding is we're going to do just a lot of kind of Q&A, so I'll start by talking a little bit about what I do and Stanford Internet Observatory and some of the recent things that we've focused on and how a lot of these different areas, conspiracy theories, state-sponsored actions, computational propaganda have really kind of come together and converged in certain ways. So I started working on looking at how narratives spread on the internet back around 2014, 2015. And I was a new mom at the time. I just had my first baby. And I was really interested in understanding the anti-vaccine movement in California. So we were, this was a couple months prior to the Disneyland measles outbreak, and I had started looking at why I, as a new mom, was getting targeted with a lot of anti-vaccine Facebook groups. I did some things that were like on the crunchier side. I made my own baby food, like that kind of thing. And so as a result of like joining groups for one particular type of interest, I was getting recommended into these other types of groups that were definitely not interest aligned for me. And I thought that was a really interesting dynamic. So a couple of months later, the Disneyland measles outbreak happened, and I called my congressman. I asked to be involved in the bill to eliminate vaccine opt-outs in California. We used to have a system where you could just decide not to vaccinate and sign a paper saying that you had decided that, and that was it. And I thought, that was really kind of putting communities and children at risk, and I didn't like that. And so when this opportunity to get involved in working on that law came up, I said, okay, I'm going to take it. And so there were a bunch of us moms who volunteered to work on that, and I was the kind of data science mom. And the opposition research mom. And as part of doing that project, it was like 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. every night was, get involved in like anti-vax land on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and everywhere else. I started looking at how networked activism, which had some really good positive, like abilities for small groups to get their message out there to the world, also had engaged with platform algorithms in some interesting ways that allowed for small groups to achieve a very disproportionate impact if they used the right keywords, if they had sensational content. And so I started looking at ways in which the more conspiratorial content, the idea that, there were people who didn't want to vaccinate because they felt that for whatever reason it was government overreach, that was kind of like a political position. But the people who were really in it and involved in it because they believed that the government was behind a vast cover-up concealing the fact that vaccines caused autism, that's a little bit of a different alignment. And that kind of content really was traveling quite far and quite fast. And so I started doing network mapping, social network analysis on Twitter, just looking at very public conversations, examining how these messages evolved over time, looking at which ones went the furthest, and looking at how different groups kind of coordinated with each other to amplify each other's messages and to oftentimes game the Twitter hashtags so that their message would be the thing that people would see when they looked at a hashtag related to the bill or paid attention to an article that was that had just come out. So this was a very interesting project. We did get that law passed, but what we started to see was ways in which the anti-vaccine movement was actively networking with the kind of very far libertarian, at the time it was the Tea Party, actually. This was a little bit before the kind of MAGA movement, so this was the Tea Party movement, to really push the idea that vaccinations were vast government overreach, and ways in which they were networking with the kind of Second Amendment activists and the militia groups. And that kind of dynamic is now what we're seeing today in the context of COVID-19 and the reopen protests. So a lot of the same kind of organizational groundwork that went into gaming Twitter algorithms and things during the SB 277 campaign are now being put to use during the COVID-19, a lot of the conspiracies around masks, around pandemic. And of course, at this point, things have really exploded, and now we have the QAnon groups that are involved and intimately connected as well. One of the things that was interesting about the aftermath of the SB 277 was the number of the bill, the vaccine law fight, was the way in which I had created a Facebook account. And I used the Facebook account to follow all of the anti-vaccine pages. And I did it because I didn't want to pollute my my real Facebook account. So this was funny enough. Facebook did eventually find this account and shut it down. But for a while it was up, and it just followed the pages. It didn't talk. It didn't comment. It just followed the pages, and it started to get referred into Pizzagate groups, and then subsequently into QAnon groups. So it was interesting to me to see the same way that I, as just a mom with my kind of real account, with my real interests, was pushed anti-vaccine interests. Those who then, in turn, were following those anti-vaccine pages, those very conspiratorial pages, were getting pushed into an even different rabbit hole, which was Pizzagate, and then subsequently QAnon. So we did start to see the ways in which that recommendation engine was acting as a kind of conspiracy correlation matrix, basically just saying, if you have this particular alignment, you are statistically similar to these other people who have this particular alignment. And so we're going to show you their conspiracy and see if you, choose to go join the group. So it was everything from chemtrails and flat earth, which is, the kind of pseudoscience conspiracies, to the anti-government, so-and-so is running a sex dungeon in a pizza place kind of stuff. So that was, for me, the takeaway after that bill was passed was really that the internet as a system was broken. And what I meant by that was that I felt that there was really an ability for conspiratorial communities to achieve not only a disproportionate impact, but that once you were immersed in one of these rabbit holes, or once you were immersed in one of these kinds of communities, what you saw just kind of continued to feed into that and to reinforce it. And so I got very interested in the psychology of echo chambers and the dynamics of online crowds, and how we could think about the internet both as something that had, how could we reconcile this idea that we wanted to have free expression, right? This was what the internet was designed to, this was the great promise of the internet. We wanted to have that ability for activist groups and new emerging candidates to kind of come out of nowhere and not be beholden to gatekeepers and special interests and large amounts of money. This was kind of the beauty of the system as it had been designed. But then there was this other side of it where the algorithms were somewhat amoral. They didn't really fully, there was no understanding of what was being recommended. So pushing bleach cures for autism, or some of these kind of more grotesque facets of health misinformation that actively harmed people, were just as likely to be recommended, and perhaps even more so, because of the sensational nature of the content, because it was very high engagement, and that was what the algorithms were keying off of. So I started writing a little bit about that and talking a little bit about it. And I saw in, I think, one of the blurbs that I was going to talk about my career as a tech writer also, which I am not really like a tech writer in the sense that I'm not a journalist. I just started wanting to submit pieces because I felt like I was having this observation, and I felt a little bit like Chicken Little, actually. Like I was saying that conspiracy theories on the internet were going to be a disaster, and that this tool that had given us some really wonderful positive change, also had some very significant unintended consequences. And it seemed like I am in tech. I live in San Francisco. I work in tech. I had a startup at the time. And so I was trying to say it not from the point of view of like a neo-Luddite, like we need to shut the whole thing down, but more from the point of view of like we needed to kind of build in some guardrails, maybe consider sort of like downstream harms of some of the ways that recommendations and curation and search results were returning their content, which I think now today in 2020 is not a very remarkable thing to be saying. I think actually a lot of people have kind of gotten there. But in 2015, that was not really that was not really where we were. So my own work, interestingly, took kind of an unexpected turn. I started doing this writing, and I started doing these contributed articles, Wired, Fast Company, places that I had just pitched, I want to write a story about this, or I want to write about my research on, my nighttime research, because like I said, I had a whole other job. And I started doing that. And then somebody from the Obama administration, Todd Park, the former chief data officer, reached out to me and said, look, we're doing some of this work on ISIS. And a lot of what you're describing in your articles about this kind of network activism and this sort of the momentum that comes from some of the sensational content, how viral it goes before it's taken down, even if it's clearly a terms of service violation. Like this is at the time the ISIS beheading videos were happening. And they asked me, would you come and, kind of volunteer for 3 weeks at State Department, because they're putting together a team of 6 people, most from the technology industry, a couple marketers who were looking at how to think about what happens when the internet is used as a vast tool for terrorist and foreign state propaganda. And that was very hard to say no to, Like I said, I had a young kid, but I did in fact fly out to DC to work on that project. Rick Stengel, former Undersecretary of State, recently wrote a book about it. It was really all about how this was kind of the government's big chance to get ahead of it, and what kind of organizational structures the government was thinking about, given that all of a sudden the same dynamics that any local domestic ideologue or conspiracy theorist could use were being used by terrorist organizations as well. And at the same time, while we were on that project, while we were thinking through what a state response would look like, again, narrowly tailored to a state adversary, the conversation turned to Russia. And so this was in October 2015. And it was interesting to me to hear that as we kept emphasizing that the problem was the system, right? The problem was how content hopped from platform to platform. The problem was the nature of virality, how very different it was than the kind of slow pace of information flows in the past. Problem was, in some ways, the participatory nature, the ways in which ordinary people would get caught up and continue to share along the content. But at the same time, we didn't want to see a government intervention tailored to solely counterterrorism, because those of us who were working on this from the tech point of view felt very acutely that it was a system level problem, and that while ISIS was one of the entities that could use it, designing a counter ISIS effort was not going to mitigate the problem itself, because the next organization would come in and be able to do the same thing. So the question became, how do you preserve that freedom of expression? How do you preserve that right to activism, while at the same time recognizing that something that is a tool can also be a weapon, depending on how it's used? And in the course of that conversation, Russia began to come up. And that was because the Internet Research Agency was a known entity at that point. And Adrian Chen had actually written a really fantastic article about it called The Agency in the New York Times about 5 months prior. So those of us who were paying attention to the idea of, for me, the fascination was like, this is modern propaganda. What is modern? What does that mean? How do we think about the system as basically a kind of a vector for democratized propaganda and for the kind of modernization of what we call agents of influence, sort of subversive personas that are working in the system to kind of create chaos. So we started looking at the Russia challenge as well, but there wasn't very much of that really wasn't the focus, interestingly, and I think that was, in retrospect, quite unfortunately, a missed opportunity to deal with what came to be the massive Internet Research Agency operation, which was quite nascent in 2015, and I don't think many people took it very seriously. It was really just some kind of crappy fake pages and meme accounts. The early stuff wasn't very impressive, but they got dramatically better at it as time went on, and unfortunately, again, the focus was so much on what to do about ISIS. The reception from the platforms at the time was also really very much more around if we take steps to deal with this, then what is the slippery slope of this intervention? Which is an important question to ask, and one that we still ask today, even as policies have begun to be put in place. But the question was, if one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter is a phrase I unfortunately don't know the attribution to off the top of my head right now. But the challenge was like, if they were to take action against a particular group or a particular message or a particular content framework, what would that mean for subsequent protest movements? And also, if the US government was interested in this intervention against ISIS, what might in the future, say, the Chinese or Russian government be interested in intervening against, and what would the platform have to do in response to that inquiry? Because these were companies with global audiences. So that was where we were. And for me, it really was kind of like a weird career change. It wasn't a thing I'd ever planned on getting into, but I felt like this was one of the really significant problems, but also opportunities of our time, in the sense that this was a fundamental rethinking of communication infrastructure. It was much bigger than simply stopping adversarial attacks. It was actually thinking about what should our communication systems look like, and what should the ways in which we, how do we preserve the ways in which we relate to each other, the ways in which we facilitate activism. How do we not design policies that are against the people we don't like, or the political beliefs we don't like? How do we think at a higher level around what this system should look like? And so that was, for me, I wound up staying at my company a little while longer at a supply chain logistics startup. But I got really involved in the efforts to call the tech hearings in early 2017. So after the election, we began to find more and more evidence of the Russian activity, and more evidence that it had in fact reached far, far more people than previously thought. That in fact we were talking tens to hundreds of millions of Americans, as opposed to a very small audience, and that it had in fact been quite well tailored and well targeted, that voter suppression was a big component of it, that the African American community had really been disproportionately targeted, and we wanted to begin to see some accountability from the platforms. And so I got to know Tristan Harris and Roger McNamee pretty well during that point. Tristan read some essay I wrote and then reached out, and we found out we had like 80 Facebook friends in common. So it's funny even when Facebook actually does kind of at its best really show you how you're connected to people. And so we met on Facebook, funny enough. And so we tried to think again, how do you not destroy this this tool, this really powerful communication platform, this way that people can connect, while at the same time improving it. And the goal of calling the tech hearings was to have a very national security oriented focus on, again, the very particular state actors, so not activism and fake pages and groups writ large, but really very targeted at how state actors had begun to use the platform to interfere in elections. So that was where, for me, the kind of foray into tech policy came about largely as a result of that, as a result of suddenly finding myself in a position where the legislators were interested and wanted to try to understand what had happened. And at the same time, they really came at it with a very basic knowledge. So I remember making slides explaining what a click-through rate was and how ad targeting worked. And I was just trying to walk through how the system had been used, all of the various facets of the tools that were available had been put to use towards this influence campaign. So again, things like advertising, which, is quite mundane most of the time, had in fact taken on this slightly different turn in these very different hands. And that was how I wound up getting involved in tech policy. Was actually just doing it, feeling somewhat unqualified and reaching out to a whole lot of people to get up to speed and figure out what could be done and what was feasible, and how to get over some of my initial opinions about CDA 230 or various things that I thought were the problem, and to develop some sense of what was possible for regulators, what was possible for the platforms, what was possible to achieve change on through raising public awareness. So that was my, I feel like that's been 20 minutes of chatting about the work that I've done. Now I'm at Stanford Internet Observatory, and I'll take 2 more minutes just to talk about what we do there before starting to chat Q&A style. Stanford Internet Observatory was set up by Alex Stamos, who had been Facebook's chief security officer. So he's the director. And what we look at is ways in which the internet is misused, or ways in which the internet, this is of course a huge topic, mostly social networks, and mostly the social web, is used for a variety of manipulative behaviors. So I lead research. We have a team of a little over a dozen fantastic people. The vision is really having both technical capabilities to understand the internet, to understand the social web. So building the things needed to understand how information flows, how information moves. And at the same time, a deep research bench of analysts. Well, I call them analysts, but some of them are analysts. A lot of them are, postdocs, professors who have really deep experience in particular regions or particular topics or focuses, and want to take that understanding of the world, that deep qualitative knowledge, or sometimes that deep topical knowledge, and layer in these forms of analysis that use social network analysis to inform a better understanding of dynamics in their areas of focus. So someone who focuses on democratic development in Africa, for example, might look at election manipulation in Africa and might use tools that we're developing to understand that at a more how the social system is interfacing with the domestic politics and the realities on the ground that have been going on for quite some time. So what we try to do is develop capabilities that allow for 3 things. First is proactive detection of various types of manipulation. So that's a very kind of quantitative process. So social network analysis tools, anomaly detection, ways in which we look at norms, how do communities normally behave, and then do they behave in different ways ahead of a particular operation. We look at forensic analysis. That's kind of the second big bucket, where when an attributed operation has been found, such as either by a platform or sometimes by us, we'll work in conjunction with the platforms to do the analysis and understand the full spectrum of how the operation was carried out. So we've spent a lot of time on that lately, both of those areas, proactive detection as well as forensic analysis, looking at COVID-19 and looking at election-related activities. And so those have been, we have a thing called the Virality Project that's looked at how nation states have used both broadcast media and social media, kind of a full spectrum propaganda operation, to spread narratives that they want to spread related to COVID-19. Sometimes the focus is domestic and internal, things that they want their populations to believe, and sometimes it's outward facing, things that they want to project to the world. So China has been a big focus of that one, also the United States, Iran, Saudi Arabia. I think we've got Brazil and Venezuela coming up. So we have a lot of these ways in which we'll look at the same topic, but understand how different nation states or different activist groups are engaging in the conversation around that. And then we also do work with, when Twitter does a big platform takedown, we will, or Facebook will participate in the analysis. So we do independent analysis in which we come to our own conclusions about what happened using the data sets from the companies, and then expanding out to look at the rest of the web outside of Facebook and Twitter to develop a clearer picture of how that influence operation was carried out. And so that's independent research, but oftentimes does then inform, it can be used either to inform a takedown or to explain a takedown to the public. So that's the sort of second area of work. And then policy, which is how do we take what we learn through this process and use it to inform policymakers in Washington, D.C., in the state of California, New York AG's office, a range of actors that come looking for an understanding of how these things are going to relate to their work. So kind of multi-stakeholder policy engagement. And I guess I will stop there and just start taking questions.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Renee. So as we wait for questions to come in on the chat, I have my own list for you. So we'll start with, you said that the internet as a system is broken, I think correctly. And one tricky aspect about it is that it's just so big. And one solution is the thought that we should return to a more like community-based, localized news model. So I wanted to ask, do you see any promise in returning to a more localized news model?
That for a long time, right? The idea of decentralization, right? What is that? What does it look like when people move back into smaller communities? There's definitely, there's kind of pros and cons. On the influence operations side, which is what I spend most of my time thinking on, it is when you have people all in one place, they're easier to target, they're easier to find. And that's been one of the interesting dynamics with something like Facebook groups. You're telling the world who you are or what you're interested in just by participation in the group. And if you move people into smaller spaces, WhatsApp chats, or more kind of decentralized, particularly decentralized and encrypted, usually go hand in hand in a lot of the the dynamics these days. It does make it sometimes harder to reach people, but it also makes it harder to see things that are kind of percolating, that are not so great. So there's trade-offs. I think this is of course the challenge for any policy anywhere. There are always trade-offs. There are always going to be unsatisfying things that you try to balance to try to achieve the best possible outcome. For news itself, I really do think yes, the kind of destruction of local news, the economic hit that it took, the huge gaps are a problem. One of the areas that we really see that is that there's like predatory replacements now. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of these, both on the left and on the right, unfortunately, I think pink slime was the phrase that Columbia Journalism Review used to describe what are basically spam sites, all centrally controlled by one person who pushes out content that's nominally local, but there's no real reporters on the ground. There's nobody there to contextualize for a particular community or to do the actual investigative journalism or the local develop that local trust that local news used to have. So instead, it's more like almost like spam that just has San Francisco on the top of it, or Hartford or wherever, name the municipality. So in areas where there has been that kind of death of the local news media ecosystem, I think yes, having a return to trusted local sources that are able to communicate with communicate with people in a way that is authentic and resonates. And I think that there's a very significant gap there. I think focusing on, as we're beginning to do a lot of our election 2020 work, one of the things that we're looking at is what do you do when certain small regions are targeted, right? And who is responsible for communicating to people what they need to know or what they need to understand or see. And not everybody trusts large media, unfortunately, or not everybody feels like it's written for them or produced for them. And so the question becomes, who does have that moral authority and where is that trust? And that is, I think, a thing that that media really does need to be, we all, need to be working on rebuilding.
Thank you. And one more question before we turn to questions from the chat. But your Twitter handle is @NoUpside. What's the story behind
Story behind that one. So I had a Twitter handle that was my name, and I was on Wall Street at the time. So I was a derivatives trader for 7 years, and I was at a firm called Jane Street, which is a great, I had a great experience there for 7 years. But Twitter came while I was there, and I was fascinated by it because, so we have, if you're high frequency trader like I was, or I ran an arbitrage strategy, you really needed reliable information as quickly as possible, right? That was a big part of the work. And so I had a Twitter account in part because I would keep it up in a corner. I had like 6 monitors, and I would keep Twitter up in a corner of my screen because I was curious to see like what broke first. I remember distinctly, like there was a British prime minister who was either resigning or giving a press conference, and I had it up on the screen on Twitter. And I also had my Bloomberg has a news ticker, and there would be these things called red headlines. And when a red headline would come across, that meant something very important had just happened. And I really was fascinated by Twitter because I felt like it was competing all of a sudden with this sort of like, here's the professional journalist, the vetted information up here, and here's this like almost like raw intelligence feed coming in just by regular people who are sitting there with their thumbs at a place at a moment in time. So I really liked Twitter kind of from day one, just as a place to be. And I had a snarky sense of humor. And during the 2008 financial crisis, there was new news breaking constantly. And there would be these like absurd statements made by some big bank people, and I would make fun of them. And I was doing it with my name attached. And the partners at the firm were really not happy about that. So I got pulled into a room and I was told, like, there's no upside to you having a Twitter account. Like, you can't, lock it down. The last thing we need is like the New York Times calling us because like some idiot junior underling, said something crazy or stupid on this newfangled platform. And so I did, I locked it. But once you've locked it, I had like 30 followers who were like my real life friends. And so I felt like all of a sudden I couldn't actually participate in any of the interesting conversations. And when I decided to leave the firm, when I was like, okay, it's time for a career change, I knew I wanted to go back into tech. That's what my degree's in. And I felt like I needed to network because you don't really have a network when you're on Wall Street. You're pretty insular, you don't really tell people about your strategies or anything. So I felt like, okay, I have to go meet people now. Now I need to network. And so I made this other Twitter handle called No Upside in response to that. Like, there's no upside to you having a Twitter handle. And it was a little bit of a fuck you. There's a little bit of like, if they find it now and I get fired while I'm on my way out anyway. So I just kind of went with it. And that is, every now and then I do wish I had like just stuck with my real name. But I don't know, it's just kind of stuck at this point.
Yeah, it's a good story. So now we're going to turn to questions from the chat. So Priya is asking, thoughts on a federal administration being created to regulate internet or hate groups or pseudoscience groups, and would you want to be on it?
Well, in the US, you really can't do that. That's part of, that's the, really bumps up against the First Amendment. One of the ways that we think about influence operations and how to understand this kind of content now is actually not just the substance of the content. Again, as I mentioned, like we want to have narrative agnostic policies that aren't predicated on what the 5 people in the room making them personally believe. And so one of the things that we look at a lot is kind of content, voice, and dissemination. The sort of, the content is considered, particularly in the context of health misinformation, because there's sort of demonstrably falsifiable claims that are made where if they cause harm, such as colloidal silver will prevent you from getting coronavirus, so don't wear a mask, just drink some silver. This is one of these things that makes the rounds. That's a thing that has like serious negative impact. And so that goes kind of one step beyond me saying I think coronavirus doesn't exist, right? So the kind of second thing is a thing that the platform can intervene on out of this rubric of harm. So there are some ways in which content is considered. But then the other things that we really look at are like a lot of the interesting challenges is it's not that regular people have an opinion online or someone is saying something mean or hateful online. It's the disproportionate amplification that kind of goes along with it. So it's the tree falling in the woods problem, right? You can, if somebody says something or does something and they have 6 followers and nobody ever sees it, that's treated a little bit differently than if something is kind of a coordinated campaign. So we're looking at ways in which inauthentic distribution patterns and inauthentic accounts really drive so much of so much of the kind of malign content, as it's called, that makes its way through. This isn't to say that there aren't real groups doing this in true name domestically. And that leads to kind of a whole other set of policy considerations, right? Or moderation, content moderation policy considerations. That's not the kind of thing that the government in this country would weigh in on. And where we have seen other countries where governments have decided to weigh in on it, it's usually in favor of kind of trying to, pushing regulation that would preserve either the power of the existing regime or would take power away from the citizens and put it in the hands of the more powerful. And so one of the challenges has really been, how do you think about policies that recognize the harms that these moments create sort of with other users, but also recognize that a lot can be done within the platform. So what is the framework that we want the platform, which is not beholden to the First Amendment in a legal sense, to follow? And so that's where a lot of the work on hate groups and pseudoscience has been happening. So it's more, what are the demonstrable harms of these groups? How do we think about these groups? What are the moderation frameworks that mitigate their impact? Even with the anti-vaccine stuff, in 2019, I helped work on the policy just as an outside, they called me up to ask what I thought of it. The policy was to downrank certain types of anti-vaccine content, to remove it from the recommendation engines, right? So that it wasn't constantly being pushed at people, but ultimately to leave the groups up. And I think that that's one of these areas where in 2019, that was the kind of step that was taken. And now in 2020 and 2021, we'll be doing evaluations of how well those policies worked. And it'll be the same thing with a lot of the policies to deal with the hate group stuff, where again, the question is, how do we quantify the harms? How do we think about mitigating the reach? How do we think about actioning against the terms of service violation and what we want the terms of service to say, as opposed to something like a federal administration or government entity doing it?
Yeah, thank you. And your answer here feeds really nicely into another kind of theme of questions that we're seeing in the chat. So Victor is asking, how can we make listening to other perspectives in mass media more attractive? We all know it's good, but it seems so hard for everyone to normalize it. And then along with that, Larissa is asking, and how do we change algorithms to present alternative perspectives? And how do we change social media algorithms to be more inclusive and better and diverse? And so the theme of what is allowed to exist versus what is amplified, I'm wondering how can we use this to improve our news feeds?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think people would feel, I think, a little bit like it was overreach if the platforms would just suddenly spontaneously do it. You see people, as Twitter changed, at one point, you only saw what you followed on Twitter in reverse chronological order. And then as curation, one of the reasons why curation is what it is because when more and more content was created, the platforms felt compelled to show what was the most engaging or exciting content, not, your uncle saying I ate a sandwich, or, the kind of, remember what people used to put out on Facebook? I do. It's literally I went to the gym today, So how could they have those open spaces where people would express themselves, but also curate a little bit what you would see, because you were not going to spend hours and hours scrolling through the whole feed. When news was kind of layered in there, that was when again, sensational articles, clickbait was a huge problem. And it was treated under a spam rubric, right? Not under a fake news rubric. It was really just this is manipulative or misleading in the sense that it overpromises and this user experience is not very satisfactory. So we will deprecate certain types of clickbait. Things that say like and share all over them, again, same thing. It's really kind of that's not the sort of stuff people want to see in their feed. So the question became, how do you curate something high quality? I personally think curation is going to be sort of the next frontier in how we rethink, a lot of these systems, because that is where a lot of, some of it is personalization, and some of it is proactive, is proactive suggestion. You can't keep people from seeing the things that they've chosen to follow, right? So there's always going to be some segment of the population that chooses to kind of go deep and narrow into this, into a bubble or an echo chamber. But for the rest of it, I think there's been kind of mixed social science research. The data hasn't been very good. But as as Facebook and others have made more data available, the sort of mixed research findings that suggest that people don't actually like having unsolicited other opinions kind of pushed into their feed. It actually kind of entrenches more in very, very partisan users. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for that kind of introduction, that kind of importance of considering all opinions to come through schools, right? To come through turning that into a social norm in colleges and in high schools and in middle schools even. We're emphasizing the importance of seeing different perspectives, including kind of ideological viewpoints. I think that there is really something to be said for that. I follow a lot of conservatives. I'm pretty moderate myself, but I feel like occasionally, you get like a little spike of rage. How can that person think that thing? What the hell? But I think ultimately it's been, for myself, kind of curating my own feed that way means I feel like I see more of what people in other circumstances or other parts of the country are thinking or seeing. And even if I don't like it, it doesn't, it's still there, right? It doesn't do me any good to not like it. So I would like to see a little more of that. There was a great tool called Gobo, a project that I think it was out of MIT and maybe Media Lab, but it definitely I did at MIT. Ethan Zuckerman's. Oh, it was I think the Civil Society. Sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the specific team. But it would allow you to kind of, you could auth and allow it to look at your Facebook and Twitter feed, and then you could use these sliders to tell it what you wanted more of. And so it was really very much more like a very granular user control. If you wanted to see more tweets from women, you could do that. If you wanted to see more, tweets from a certain geographical region, you could do that. And it put controls in users' hands. But I think that for me, it was an interesting way to explore, and I think other people would likely do this too, what your feed looks like, if you do incorporate in these other types of voices or these other types of feeds, and how that might change your perspective. I think we have to normalize that a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you for that. So Sarah has a question. What do you think a dangerous misconception people have about internet conspiracies, and maybe what is something we can do as individuals to counteract the stickiness and effectiveness?
I think the most dangerous misconception is probably that that they stay on the internet. I feel like QAnon is beginning to make people realize that that's not true. And there's been a lot of attention to QAnon just over the last 2 weeks, and in particular as some of these congressional candidates are, the woman in Georgia who just won her primary. The interesting dynamic there, I think for a lot of people, the question was like, surely they don't really believe this, and surely this is just a cynical, kind of attempt to just win over voters who are low information, but who happen to form a large block within the particular district they're running in. I know I had that thought back a couple of years ago. And then you realize that, in fact, no, there are a lot of people who have come to believe this stuff. I think people look to these theories in part because they feel a loss of control, or they feel that the world is very hard to make sense of. And we've seen, particularly during the pandemic, the overwhelming rise of health conspiracies. And that's because good information really isn't getting out there into the world. This is kind of pursuant to the second question there about counteracting their effectiveness. There is not, when people don't trust the World Health Organization or the CDC to be giving them good information, they're going to trust whatever it is that they're seeing in their feed from people, or as we mentioned earlier with the journalists, media figures who they do trust. And so that application of that kind of tribalizing of trust, to use, just make up a phrase right now, but just that way in which you trust people because they're like you, or you trust people because they're on the TV channel that you watch the most. That has created some very, very bad incentives for those, for those kind of media figureheads. But it also means that if somebody who's getting all of their news from Fox News or from the kind of fever swamps of the, conspiracy theory lands on the internet, they have a fundamentally different view of reality than somebody who is getting their news from mainstream media, or somebody who's getting their news from far left media. And so the biggest, I think, problem that we face with this is these, the way in which it's created almost these like bespoke realities, right? Where in your bubble, in your sphere, this is what is real. And anybody outside who's saying anything different is one of those other people who, is being misled, or is a dupe or a sheep or whatever else. And that framework, that complete inability to take in information from outside groups, from other sources, from people who are in a different political tribe, if you will, that I think is one of the real challenges that we face with the dynamics, just the organization of how we engage on social media today. There are people who sincerely believe that Bill Gates is, on a mission to microchip the world and profit from it. And there are people who believe that 5G somehow, God knows how, spreads coronavirus. And then the problem is that does leap off of the internet, and you do see people going and setting 5G towers on fire, or threatening doctors, or, showing up to research labs to, film your hospital, showing up to a pizza place with a gun to free children in a basement that doesn't exist, right? The kind of Pizzagate thing from 2015. So that, I think, is where we start to see that it really is leaping off of the internet, and is very much a real world phenomenon. So people are not only misled in what they see on their social media feeds, they take that with them out into the real world. And I think COVID-19 and has really made clear the extent to which that's happening.
Yeah, good answer. So our second to last question will be from one moment, Erin. So I hate to bring it up, but what do you think of blockchain?
It's funny. I've been a blockchain, I was a pretty big skeptic early on, mostly because, I don't want to give a finance lecture here, but my kind of early feeling with Bitcoin was that it was not really a currency, because a currency has to function as a means of exchange, and it didn't. It just functioned as a store of value. This is my anyway. I see it as useful in a couple of areas, but there are a lot of things that a database can do better, more relevantly. So I don't really have a strong sense of, I mostly look at it with some confusion on, this idea that it's going to fix facts. I don't think that's necessarily true. I talk to Balaji about this sometimes. He's an interesting character on Twitter. He's at Balaji, and he has a lot of really great thoughts on ways in which decentralization and kind of using the blockchain to verify facts, or offering people bounties almost for producing good facts or reliable information will create a market for reliability and more, I don't know, I feel like I'm gonna botch this up, more reliable, traceable, provable information. And I see people who are working on that. I'm curious to see how it goes. It just hasn't been an area that I've spent a lot of time on.
Makes sense. All right, for our last question, I think we all like to think that we're balanced and informed people, but I think we could all improve our own media diets too. So what's one recommendation that you have for us? How can I, for instance, improve my own news feed, or improve the way that I get information?
I think it's It's a great question. I'm trying to think of how I just started following a bunch of first kind of conservative publications. You know, for me, it was National Review, and I'd always read the Wall Street Journal. You know, as I was on Wall Street, but just finding more Daily Caller. I think I wound up following at one point. Just kind of going down the list and starting with publications and seeing what headlines they were pushing out, and just looking at how their headlines and how they're framing, kind of either conflicted with, contrasted with, lined up with, and had some small overlap with my more, my kind of original media diet, which was mostly New York Times, Washington Post, and kind of, those types of CNN. I added a bunch of international ones also. I thought that would be kind of interesting. So I do have, I have some of the state media feeds. I follow the state media from China and Russia. That's always, I'm not advocating that from like a, real, you have to do it with like kind of some extreme skepticism, I think, recognizing where you're, what you're getting and what its agenda is. But there is, I did add those to mine also, just so that I could see. And then I added in more just kind of general international perspectives as well, finding kind of the biggest newspapers in certain regions and that had English language, and adding those into. I really feel like also then finding interesting influencers who are part of those communities, part of communities outside of your own, was another good way to see what, less news and more just kind of chatter in class commentary kind of focus. So I did that too. And then interestingly, with Twitter, it'll of course recommend you. If you follow one of them, you're going to get 6 more pushed at you. So so there was that. I think some people do it with lists, which is one way to do it. If you don't want to kind of pollute your main with a whole bunch of different stuff, you can also just create lists, and then you can kind of go through and check and see. And that's been interesting. I've seen a couple of these Twitter bots and things where you can follow them and you can kind of go and see what somebody's feed looks like if they're very conservative in rural Nebraska versus ultra left in San Francisco. And so a little bit more developing empathy for what other people are seeing and what kind of concerns are top of mind for them.
All right, Renee, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's been fun.
All righty. So our next talk will be at the top of the hour in just 5 minutes. We're going to be bringing on Afua Bruce to talk about criminal justice reform, the opioid epidemic, and her work at New America. So we'll see you soon.
Hey everyone, welcome back. It's 2 o'clock and now I'm super excited to introduce our next speaker, Afua Bruce. Welcome, Afua. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today.
So Afua is currently the Chief Program Officer at DataKind. She was formerly the Director of Engineering for the Public Interest Technology program at New America, where she oversaw projects in technology and policy to improve outcomes in criminal justice reform, foster care systems, immigration, the opioid epidemic. Basically, Afua has worked on so many different projects and problems, and I'm so excited to have you here. Afua is also my mentor, so thanks so much. I'll let you take the stage.
Great. Thanks so much, Larissa. I am so excited to be with you all today. I'm just going to make sure that you can all see my screen, which I think you can now. So yes, Larissa, thank you for that introduction. And again, I'm so excited to be with you all today. I wish I had something like this when I was still in school or just out of undergrad. So one, I'm jealous that you all get to spend the day or these couple of days engaging in this content, but two, just incredibly honored to be able to share some of my thoughts and reflections on my work and my career path with you today. So I want to ground our conversation today with a quote from John Lewis, the recently deceased American civil rights leader. He said this once: "Nothing can stop the power of a committed and determined people to make a difference in our society." And I think about this a lot when I think about the Tech for Good movement broadly. It's a bunch of people who have honed in on their technical skills that they have, who've identified their strengths, their interests, and their passions, and figured out a way to marry them together to make a difference in our society, to push our society forward, to make sure that we have equal access for key services and key ways for folks to engage. I've also heard it said that the future is here when it comes to technology, but it is not evenly distributed. And so I think of this group of committed people, yourselves included, as being part of making sure we can make this future more evenly distributed. So I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about how I got to where I am now. And most of my educational experience was spent with people telling me that I needed to pick one of my interests. I could be a computer engineer, or I could do something community service related, or I could do something writing related, or. And even as I started to examine particular careers in the public interest space, specifically within public service and going into government work or nonprofit work, again, people told me I had to pick one way to enter and one way to show up in the sector indefinitely. If I entered as someone who was an IT professional, that alone would be my career path. If I entered as a manager, that's what I could do. If I entered as a policymaker or policy advisor, that is what I would do there. It was always this pick one and stay in your lane. But instead, I decided to choose my own path. I'm going to talk just a little bit about my specific career background so you get an idea of where I'm coming from and how I've gotten the experiences that have really shaped me and informed my view of the world. I started off my career as a software engineer at IBM. I did my undergraduate at Purdue University, majoring in computer engineering, and all through undergrad and after undergrad worked at IBM. I then decided to take a leave of absence from IBM to go to business school. I went to the University of Michigan, go blue for any of you fellow Wolverines who are on the call today, and had completely planned on going back into the for-profit tech sector and doing some strategic roles in that sector, but ended up being recruited by the FBI to work in their science and technology branch as an internal consultant. So I ended up spending several years at the FBI, which was a surprise to everyone, including myself. I never thought that government service was for me. I never thought that I would ever even consider working at a nonprofit either. And the irony of that is that since my MBA, I've exclusively worked in government and nonprofits. But after spending several years at the FBI, touching all of different types of their engineering division, their crime lab, their criminal justice information services. I then took a tour of duty and spent a couple of years leading the White House's National Science and Technology Council. There I really got to see the wide breadth of everything that the U.S. federal government invests federally funded research and development dollars in. Everything from cybersecurity to plant genomics to STEM education to harmful algal blooms. I got to touch it all and really get an appreciation for how strong scientific and technical research and disciplines really inform the lives of Americans and the ways that we interact with each other and the ways that we show up in the world. From there, went back to the FBI for a little bit to finish up a specific project. But then, as has been mentioned, I worked at New America, which is a think tank based in DC. I was the director of engineering of the Public Interest Technology Program. And they're getting to help launch the Public Interest Technology University Network, as well as oversee fellows who are doing work in everything from criminal justice reform to immigration policy to the opioid epidemic and so much more. The underlying thread being problems that the public sector faced. And I'm currently the Chief Program Officer at DataKind. I'll talk a little bit more about DataKind later. And so I've had the privilege of working in a few different sectors and several different jobs. And so sometimes people ask, well, how do you define yourself? What do you say when people ask you, who are you and what types of work are you looking for? And the answer is I really now define myself and often describe myself as a public interest technologist. And for those of you who may be less familiar with this term, public interest technology refers to the study and application of technology expertise to advance the public interest, generate public benefits, and promote the public good. There's space in public interest technology for both people with extreme technical expertise, but also for non-technical individuals as well, because it's really about the intersection of those and how do you center a problem and bring to bear your understanding of technology, your understandings of the inner workings of the problem, your understandings of ethical trade-offs and long-term perspective taking to really make a difference in these issues that face government agencies and social sectors, NGO agencies, including NGOs. I have a strong belief that these institutions which provide services that are critical to life should have access to the same, if not better technology than the private sector does as well, because the services they provide are so important. Which brings me, of course, to the main topic of my talk today, which is data for good. And so essentially and I say data for good, and I think a lot of people hear the term data for good, the question at the core is, how do we leverage data science? How do we create data science solutions that will serve the good of many? How do we make sure that as we are using data science as broadly as it's defined, that we are doing something that will really matter to individuals, that will matter to communities, and matter in a positive way on individuals' lives and the strengths of communities. As I mentioned earlier, I currently work at DataKind. DataKind is a nonprofit organization headquartered in Brooklyn that seeks to leverage the power of data science and machine learning in service of humanity. We work with a number of pro bono experts, volunteer data scientists essentially, from across the world and pair them with social sector organizations that have some type of problem where data science can really be the most appropriate and the most effective solution. DataKind has chapters in DC, San Francisco, Singapore, Bangalore, and in the UK. We also have ways for volunteers, again, located around the globe, to plug in and to serve on volunteer teams with projects that we manage out of headquarters, so outside of those 5 geographic areas that I mentioned a little bit ago. We as DataKind have done more than 300 data for good projects in the less than 10 years that we've been around. And so really we've been able to touch organizations in the education space, in the financial inclusion space, in the health space, in the economic resilience space, and many, many more areas. Let me walk you through a couple of different examples of the types of work that we do so you get an understanding of when we say data for good, what is possible. The first DataKind project that I want to talk about is a collaboration we did with Global Witness. Now, Global Witness is an organization in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and one of the activities they do is to monitor and detect illegal and unsanctioned mines. Their health and environmental risk with unsanctioned mines, and that's defined by mines that are there without the government's approval. And so we were able to pair a team of DataKind volunteers. The lead of that team was actually, his full-time job was data scientist at Google Brain. And we paired them with Global Witness, individuals from Global Witness, to tackle this problem. And so in this case, the team was able to use publicly available satellite image and training data, and was able to build a model that detected anomalies around mining. Now, what we learned from this partnership and from this tool that we were able to develop, that the DataKind volunteer team was able to develop, is that this particular tool had high but imperfect accuracy. And so this is one example of the data science tool was effective, but you shouldn't let the data science tool alone make all the decisions. So this is a good rule of thumb in general, that humans are still needed. But in this case, the anomalies detected by the tool that the DataKind volunteer team made was able to then allow Global Witness to direct their investigations to the right places and operate much more effectively and efficiently when it came to detecting the illegal mines. Let's move on. Let's come back to the US then and look at an example in New York City. Plentiful is an application that's developed for a network of food pantries, food banks, and soup kitchens in New York City. Some of you may know that millions of Americans face food insecurity every single day. Tens of millions of children alone face food insecurity every day. And so these food pantries and food banks, the number of those has greatly increased over the past decade. Plentiful is an app that helps to address persistent issues and generates data, which was the DataKind address persistent issues within food banks. This app specifically generated data, which of course was the DataKind tie. And so the DataKind volunteer team here was able to make dashboards to track and monitor trends that helped the service providers, the food banks and food pantries, more quickly resolve issues and get more food to more people more quickly. This particular project was done about a year and a half ago, but so effective that in the height of New York City's response to the coronavirus pandemic, we actually got a note from Plentiful saying they were able to much better monitor their demand and communicate more effectively with the influx of people needing their services because of the dashboards and because of the tools that the DataKind team had developed. And so quickly, just one other example of DataKind's work. Let's go to the Caribbean, and DataKind team here partnered with an organization called Soil Haiti. Soil is dedicated to helping to provide cost-effective household sanitation services in Haiti. The DataKind team here was able to leverage OpenStreetMap and Google OR tools to optimize vehicle routes for the Soil teams as they went and needed to provide services directly in different households. Now, this project also was done, I think, about a year or so ago. And at last count, the number of trips were cut down by 13% because the routes were just that much more effective. This also means that, one, you can reach people more quickly, you can deliver your services more effectively, and you can also cut down on the fuel costs that the organization has to bear. You can also imagine that a tool such as this could be adapted based on other things that need to be delivered and through similar models. So as we think about community health workers and needing to provide medicines or care to individuals, this tool, in theory, can be adapted to those situations as well. And so with that, that's just a sampling of some of the projects that DataKind has done. And As I mentioned, DataKind has been in the data for good business for a while. And what we found is that data for good programs really need 6 components to be successful. And it really comes down to, you need a good way to be able to identify, build, and execute projects. You need to be able to bring together data scientists, people with strong technical expertise, with the subject matter experts on the ground, bring them together to help them solve problems that really matter to everyone there and will be consequential. You also, of course, need to be able to fund this. And at the end of the day, you mark your success and you measure your success specifically based on your ability for the organization, the social sector organization, on their ability to continue to deliver and achieve the organizational theory for change. Now, I've talked a lot about some projects that DataKind has done and what makes this work useful and what are some of the conditions needed for success. But really, how do you get started, right? This may be the question you're asking for yourself now. I'm personally an ex-KCD fan, so you often see one of their comics in my presentations, and this just resonates with me so well, having worked on many projects with nonprofit organizations and within government agencies, of the massive spreadsheets that have been built up over years. And yes, for those of you who've touched this, I'm sorry, I'm now reliving my trauma, but it can be hard to know where to get started when you say you're there and you want to figure out how to solve these messy, complicated problems, these messy, complicated policies that exist within the social sector. And so sometimes when people approach this, both organizations and data scientists themselves or technologists themselves say, if there's a problem, there's data. I know to solve this, I'll just add data science. And this is a great vision. It is a great idea that we can take messy problems, we can take intracted problems that people haven't been able to solve for years, decades, and just add data science and solve them effectively. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. You can't just insert a technologist into a situation, insert specifically a data scientist into a problem, into an organization, and magically get something that works. It takes a far more intentional approach. And so, when you think of the tech for good space, you often hear terms like be inclusive and design with, not for. And a question, though, I think people practically ask, though, is what does that mean? What does that mean for the organizations you're partnering with? And what does that mean for you as a technologist, you as a data scientist? How should you approach your work? And so the first underlying issue, the first underlying principle is, of course, center the problem in everything you do. Find out what matters most to that social sector organization you're partnering with. Find out what matters most to those policymakers that you're dealing with. Find out what matters most to the community that's actually going to be impacted, to the actual users, in the broadest sense of the word, the actual humans that will be impacted by the technology, by decisions made with the technology, by the policy that you're developing, and start there. And then from there, step back and say, what data do we actually have available? What are the techniques that could be relevant here? What types of structures or parameters could we put in place? And who, at the end of the day, is going to end up needing to make decisions or rely on decisions made by this tool? I also like to think through a potential negative side. What happens if this works well? What negative thing could happen if this works well? A lot of times as we're designing data science solutions, we need to remind ourselves that, data itself is just data, but the tools that we apply on top of that can bring in a whole host of biases. And being really intentional with thinking through how can what we're developing be used both for good and for not good is really important from the development side. It's also critical to make sure that you are bringing along the social sector organization as you do any type of data science work, as you do any technical work. For many projects that DataKind runs, for example, our team that meets weekly often includes someone from the partner organization. Even if that person isn't technical, it's important to keep them as part of the team because you want to make sure that you're gaining buy-in from the organization throughout the way. You want to make sure that what you develop when you leave will be able to continue to be used. It wasn't just a fun exercise or a frustrating exercise that lasted for a few weeks or for a few months. You also want to make sure that you're changing your plans, you're adapting your plans around what is culturally relevant and what will be useful in the situation. Giving another example from DataKind, we did a project recently in Nigeria, and the volunteer team had structured the algorithm to update essentially regularly. They knew that this algorithm was going to be placed on people. It was going to be, through an app placed on people's phones, on smartphones, and so the idea was to update it regularly. Well, because of where the community health workers in that case that we were, the application was going to be used by were going, they were going to places that would not have access to the high-speed internet on a regular basis. And so the team then had to go back and redesign the algorithm to update a lot less frequently. It'll update then on a push system when the user would be known to be in an area with high-speed internet. So again, making sure that you equally value the partners that you're working with, as well as the data science, making sure that you're inclusive with the people who are around the table as you're designing and testing your solutions. Now, on an even more practical level, I sometimes get asked, what should I explore? I'm interested in doing data for good. I'm interested in data science. What does that mean? Data science is a really broad term that a lot of people use to mean different things. And these tools and techniques that are listed here, everything from cleaning data to geospatial analysis, data visualization and graphics, and you can read the rest. And this list here are tools that we use at DataKind often. And so these, if you're wondering where in data science should I focus, what matters, this is a list that I would encourage you to start with and to consider developing your skills in. And I just want to close with some guiding principles for doing data for good work. And so first, focus on the critical problem. I touched on this before, but I cannot overstate the importance of centering the problem. When we are looking at the problems and the challenges that we're facing as society, the challenges that communities themselves are facing, we can't afford to start by coming in with a technical tool set and saying, I know technology and I'm here to help. I know data science and I'm here to help. Or I have an idea of this particular data set, and I'm sure that I can use it to solve your problem. That is not the way to begin any type of data for good problem. You have to go into a community. You must take the time to build relationships, to build trust, and to truly understand the problem that keeps people up at night, the problem that is most important, where the different inputs are, what the system overall looks like, what the actors are, what the outputs are, before you can then even begin analyzing the situation from a technical perspective, figuring out what data is there to then inform the solution, actually building then your data science tool, applying it and testing it, and then making sure that it can be used. It all comes down to making sure that you define the problem well and that you can go from there. The second guiding principle that I want to mention here is that solutions won't work unless they are overseen by the people doing the work. And again, touching on what I said about the importance of working both, again, from the public interest technology definition of technical and non-technical individuals, from the importance from the data for good structures that I mentioned of the partners and the data scientists all working together. It's really important that the people who will be around after a team of data scientists moves in and moves out, or even if you're a data scientist or a technologist more broadly speaking, are in-house within an organization, if you're not going to be there to run the tool and interpret the tool every single day, which you probably won't, you probably at some point will want to go on and get a different job or want to try something new. You need to make sure that you've partnered well throughout the development with the people who will be doing the work, because they are the subject matter experts for how it needs to be done and how decisions will be made based on what you develop. And then just this last sort of overarching point is that you don't have to be high tech to see the benefits of a high tech solution. And so I think sometimes people can fall into a trap of, well, I've written this algorithm and other people aren't going to understand it, so why should I bother explaining it? Or why do I need to put in some effort to translate the ones and zeros that I've coded, the if-then statements, and the loops that I had to deal with into language that others might have to understand? And it's because this ability to translate between tech and non-tech is really important, between different disciplines is really important, because there's a lot of work, obviously, that goes into building data for good solutions. But if it just sits on a shelf somewhere, if no one really can understand how to use it or how to interact with it, then you've gone through this whole process really for naught, and that is not what you want. And so with that, I'll stop here, Larissa, and take any questions.
Hey, so just like, I know we can't hear you all, but give a big, big, big round of applause for Afua Bruce. That was absolutely amazing. Thank you. So first question out the bat, how did you make the decision to move into the nonprofit and government space after finishing your MBA?
Yeah, for me, it really was the FBI job specifically. As I touched on in my talk, I never intended to go into government service or nonprofit work when I entered business school. I, really liked money. Not that you can't make money in the social sector, you certainly can. But really, as the daughter of immigrants, my parents immigrated to the US from Ghana, and I did my undergrad at a top 10 engineering school. I was getting my business degree at a top 10 engineering school, a top 10 business school. The defined career path wasn't really into community service or into public service. But really, the case for myself that I made for going to work at the FBI was that I felt like I wouldn't be able to see the same types of challenges outside of government that I would inside government. And this proved to be 100% true. I have some fun stories from my FBI days with different challenges, what it was like to learn to work with agents and hear case updates, and then, celebrate when the kid is rescued, and all of the other the positives from working with the FBI, but really being able to understand the different technical challenges and really use my unique skill set to help move that forward. The ability to do that there is what, for me, helped me to transition from the private sector into government. Once I did that for a few years, I was kind of sold. There were a lot of different areas to make an impact, and after getting over that first hurdle, I just really saw the different ways that my unique skill set could be used in the nonprofit sectors and in the government sectors.
Thanks. So the next question is from Aaron Meyer. Are there data science projects that are currently being developed by the US government that worry you?
I would say to some extent, any data science project developed by any government agency could worry me. Again, as there's a historian, Martin Kramsberg, that says something to his 5 laws of technology, one of which is something to the effect of, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And that's because, again, we can bring in our biases into anything we developed. Ulterior motives can easily be developed or incorporated into any type of algorithm. And then because, the reason why we use algorithms in part is to speed up decision making, make things happen more quickly and more efficiently. If an underlying assumption is wrong or discriminatory, the damage that can be done is done on a really long scale. So I would say I have a healthy skepticism of projects that can be developed by any government agency. There's not a specific project that's coming to mind, but there is always that potential. And I think that's why it continues to be important to take in some of the ethical considerations, to really continue to question biases and the underlying assumptions as you're developing data science solutions.
Awesome, thank you. Next question from Tasana Salsan. So sorry if I butchered your name. What's something you think the current system of public interest tech is doing well, and what's a potential improvement?
I think something the public interest tech sector is doing really well right now is just getting people excited. Again, the fact that this conference exists is a really great sign. There are programs at a number of universities, some sponsored by the Public Interest Technology University Network, some outside of the Pitt UN, which are really looking at how do we train students to do this work. Lots of students, perhaps yourselves, are in organizations that you've founded on campus, organizations that are really looking at how do we marry technology and the public interest and do it in a way that's sustainable and that matters well. And so I think that level of excitement, engagement, and really development is really exciting to see in the field. I think that's something that the sector can be doing better is there are a couple of different things, but I think one of the big things is figuring out consistent ways to talk about what we do. I don't know, I've talked to a handful of people I know on this call, and I go through this myself, but even when it comes to looking for a job in public interest tech, what words do you search on? What are the titles of the jobs? I, in my position, find that really frustrating, both when, I'm looking for a job, but also when I'm trying to post a job, what terms should I be using? What keywords do I need to be including? There's not a solid consensus on those terms yet. And so I think some type of consistency or nomenclature around just what we call some of the titles for the positions that people hold, I think that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just because Afua brought it up, I'm going to plug the organization I'm working on right now, Impactful. We do work around trying to bridge that gap between folks who want to go into social impact tech space, public interest tech space, and the organizations that do it. So Afua and I have had many conversations about what people look for, how to find those jobs, etc. Okay, next question. So you've experienced both the private and public sectors. Which side do you think is better for data for good work? And what are some opportunities and challenges on both sides?
Yeah, I can't pick sides on this one. I feel like it's a really individual decision for people. Sometimes, on the social sector side, if you're working for an NGO, at their core, they are mission driven. And so you then will be in an environment where people talk every day about the mission and really the theory of change and really touching individuals, people's lives for that issue you specifically care about by joining that specific NGO. And that is really empowering. It then means you have a really clear goal of what you're after every day and how you should be designing things and how you should be building relationships and doing outreach and all of that. And so that's just really good. On the other hand, back to the 6 components that I mentioned, fundraising and how you fund this work is really important. When you're in an NGO, you're in a constant fundraising cycle, always looking for new funds. It's just the name of the game on the nonprofit side. It's fine. But that life isn't for everyone. Salaries are often a little lower in the nonprofit sector and the government sector. And there's a lot of time required for jobs in both the public sector and in the private sector. And so for that reason also, people then, sometimes choose to go into the private sector. I've been, personally in the nonprofit and government sector for the past nearly a decade. Does that mean I'll also be here? I don't know. It's where I am today. But I do, sometimes think of going back to the private sector. And that's because, you can see different types of problems there. Also, I think the idea that you have to pick and choose between ethics in the public sector and being evil in the private sector is not the right way to frame the question, I don't think. I think that we need to figure out ways for people to have the skills of a public interest technologist, even if they are working in the private sector, because, sure that we would all like for more engineers at Facebook and Google and the like to have the public interest technology mindset as they're designing the algorithms that so many of us use and rely on a daily basis.
Yeah, thanks so much. Could not agree more. Okay, next question is from Victor. How do you think we can change CS education so that we can proactively use data for good? And how do you think students should learn to recognize and remove biases?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to CS education and how you're looking at really instilling or exposing people to doing data for good and technology for good more broadly, I think it's important to just name it explicitly. I think a lot of times when you're studying computer science, you're studying computer engineering, a lot of the sample problems that you're given in school are really framed with a public sector mindset. So I think one case or one concrete example is to start bringing in examples from the nonprofit sector and from the government sector. Several of the universities in the Public Interest Technology University Network, for example, are starting to document case studies and then make those case studies shareable so that different universities can start to reference projects that have been done in government agencies, projects that have been done in NGOs. So I think just at a fundamental level, making sure that as we're exposing students throughout their education to what makes for a good computer science project, we don't just give examples from IBM. We don't just bring in Google to talk, but we also have public interest technologists come in and talk about the real challenges they faced and the underlying technology that was required to be able to help detect illegal mines in the DRC, for example. I think there was a second part of that question that I might have missed, but maybe I touched on it.
The second part was just, how do you think students should learn to recognize and remove biases?
So on recognizing and removing biases, I think this is a constant struggle for people to continue to push yourselves out of your comfort zone. If most of your friends look like you're probably not doing that. If most of your friends are of the same political ideology as you're probably not doing that as well. And so really taking the time and effort to make sure that you're challenging yourself regularly and you're letting yourself be challenged. Also, and I think this is touched on in the previous section, be willing to and encourage and challenge yourself to, read a variety of news sources, those that both maybe confirm your biases in the way that you see the world. But if you're a big CNN person, check out Fox News every now and then. I'm sure you will learn something that will challenge your biases there.
Thanks. So next question from Vanchip. What are your views on governments using data to spy on its own citizens and do other unethical stuff, especially in dictator or authoritarian regimes? And what's the best way to tackle this issue?
There is a lot in this question. So I'll try and touch on the key points of this question. So to my previous point, data science, data in general, technology broadly can be used for a wide variety of reasons. And I think also, it's important to notice that different people define ethics in different ways. And so when you look at from country to country, I think especially what one country may see as overly intrusive, another country may see as necessary to their security. And not just country as the person or the group of people in charge, the actual citizens may define privacy in different ways across countries. So I think that's one thing that's really important to note as you're looking from country to country and things like that. I think another really interesting point to note is also what you might consider spying in one case, you might consider okay in another case. And so, for example, if I wanted to get away for the weekend because I have been in my apartment for the past 5 months and I just want to get away and, be left alone, like I probably don't care much and don't want someone finding me because my whole point is getting away. And other people probably don't care about and would be kind of maybe a little, would question it if they knew that someone was watching my every move as I was just getting away. At the same time, if I were just getting away and I had kidnapped a child and had really bad really horrible intentions with that child. Suddenly now people probably feel a little bit differently about my actions being tracked. And so this is, again, not necessarily advocating for or against spying on people, but just recognizing that technology used in one case suddenly takes on a different meaning in another case. But I think, some of what you get on when, a society is deciding that spying, however we've defined it, is really bad and we shouldn't be doing it, then we shouldn't be doing it. And then it's a case of, working through advocacy systems, working through protesting, working through a number of different councils and accountability measures that exist through different both political processes and policymaking processes to hold organizations accountable, to hold government agencies accountable, and to make them describe what they are doing and make sure it's in line with what people want. And then ultimately, vote people out to change policies. Elections have very real consequences, so show up and participate.
Thanks. I guess in reaction to some of the points you brought up and answering the last question, could you talk a little bit about the guidelines you use to figure out what's ethical and what's not for yourself working in this space?
Yeah, so for myself working in this space, again, I think the question of what could happen, if this goes well, and what could happen if this doesn't go well. So let's take an example of route optimization. So let's say we want to make sure community health workers get to deliver their care well, and so we say what happens if this goes well on the positive side? More people get care better. What happens if this goes not well? Well, if the person who is deploying community health workers actually has the ability to give out bad medicine, then community health workers' ability to do that, to get to more people more quickly, probably isn't right. And so then it becomes a question of, again, let's take a look at the system, because we don't do technologies just in a silo, we do it within a system. And so what are the checks and balances in that system? What do we think, how do we assess who gets to turn something on, who gets to turn something off, and what are the checks and balances around that? So that's some of how I approach that. I think also to the point about designing with and not for, making sure that you take the time to really assess or to talk with people who are going to be affected, not just people who are using the tool necessarily, but also some of their clients perhaps. Or constituents. Sometimes you can do that directly. Sometimes you do that through the organization you're partnering with.
Thanks. By the way, y'all, keep it coming with the questions or just comments, reactions, responses. We really feed off your energy in the comments. So thanks so much for everyone who's asked questions so far and commented. The next one is from Deepak. As the problems and its impacts are getting global, do you think there's going to be a day when non-US citizens can work for the US government?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. I think, I think that it could start through contractors and contract agencies for specific tasks. But yeah. I don't want to guess either way on this one, because it'll become like a clip that's just played back. Afua said it would never happen, and now it's happening, or vice versa. But it's a really interesting question to think of. It is also one that I felt intimately when looking to hire and staff technical positions in government. Just does restrict our access to talent when we can't hire everyone.
Okay, this next question is going to be a little bit more personal about you and your own choices. So as someone who has had so many amazing experiences throughout the tech space, how did you decide to move to new positions or take on new opportunities? What were the factors for you to say yes versus, I think I'll pass?
Yeah, so I wish I had a clearer answer for you, that I followed a specific formula, that, you know, I applied the same data science I use now on myself and all of the data when I decided to change jobs. But honestly, it was a combination of being able to point to something that I had accomplished in the current job that I was in, having real accomplishments, being able to say that, you know, I saw something through to the end, or to a major deliverable, that I was able to build some solid relationships with individuals that I was working with. That was always a prerequisite for me before being able to move on to the next job. And then, you know, was there a job that seemed interesting and that it would give me a new skill set? And so the transition from the FBI to the White House, for example, I'd had a number of positions at the FBI, and you know, had always said, not always, but like for a while, I thought, wouldn't it be crazy if I got to work on national science and technology policy someday? And then the position at the White House opened up. It seemed like a mostly good fit. I would also encourage people to not wait until you feel like you check till you would describe that you check every box, but you check most of the boxes, and then apply for the position and see if you get it. That's ultimately how I then ended up moving to the White House there. At the same time, before I did that, I applied to a couple of other positions, actually within the FBI and also within the federal government broadly, that I didn't get, that on paper I should have gotten, to the point where one person even called me to be on the selection committee for a job. And I was like, did you know I'm applying for this job that I then ended up not getting? And so, you know, it's a factor of time, something that's going to give you new skills, but also, and I feel like I can't overstate this, make sure that you've done something that you can speak to, that you've accomplished in your current job before you look to move to the next job. Time and job isn't as important though, but having serious accomplishments you can point to before moving to the next job is really important. And then the final thing that I'll add on that is you're only doing it for 2 or 3 years. I think, you know, I've been fortunate a couple of times to being forced to choose between 2 jobs that both look really good for me and would take me down 2 different paths, and having to remind myself that most people are only in jobs for 2 or 3 years. I'm not committing to a lifetime in this next position. More than likely, I'm committing to 2 or 3 years of my life. And that for me makes the decision a little bit easier.
Thanks. A question from Aaron here. What was the most challenging project you worked on throughout your career?
That is a good question. I would say one of my first projects at the FBI was probably one of the most challenging projects that I worked on. It was on working on some communication strategies and just communication protocols for engineers in a crisis response situation. And what made that the most complicated project actually was not any of the technology that was required. Actually wasn't a lot of technology required. Other people were doing technology, and it's how do we get the technology out? How do we figure out what the right technology is when there's a crisis situation, when, you know, a bomb goes off somewhere and we have to respond. But being able to, you know, being fairly new to the FBI at that time and being able to figure out the language of FBI agents and FBI engineers and to navigate that and translate it back to my technical understanding and my strategic skills, and to bring all of that together and really understand, you know, back to that public interest technology mindset, how do you bring things together? How do you navigate different solutions? How do you take that perspective, those long-term perspectives, you're doing that, and how do you translate between the different disciplines and really bring together the non-technical and technical together? It was one of my first big projects doing that, and I think I've only been in the FBI for about a year at that time, so some of the language and the nuances of working in the FBI were still fairly new to me at that time. So for those reasons, that was probably one of the most complicated projects.
Thanks. Okay. This question is from me. How do you feel the public interest tech community has responded to the Black Lives Matter movement? What have organizations done well, and what can they do better to support Black communities, both as workers in their organizations and as users?
Great question. I think Back to an earlier question to something that the public interest tech community, I don't know that I'd actually say this is negative or a positive, but just a fact of the public interest tech community is that it's pretty fragmented, right? A lot of different players exist in public interest tech, some of whom, might call themselves public interest tech, might not. In some cases, you can talk to two different public interest technology experts, and they might define the organizations differently. And so that's to say it's difficult to say across the board how the public interest tech community has responded to the Black Lives Matter movement in its current form. That said, I think that a lot of institutions, a lot of organizations are starting to think more seriously about how does what we're doing actually affect people on the ground? And not just how have we said it affects people, but how does what we're doing actually affect people on the ground? Who is actually getting access to our services and who is actually not getting access to our services? Who has been maybe unintentionally harmed through our services in the past? And so I think organizations are starting to think through that. I think organizations are also starting to think through who do I have at my design table, right? Do I not have any Black people or brown people at my design table? That's probably a problem. Do I usually only have one or two, and then after some time, the one or two leave? Why can't I retain? What is it about my organizational culture that is making it not a place where Black and brown people want to stay? I think that time will still tell as to whether organizations then go on and do the hard work to change their organizations change their organizational cultures into being places where, for those organizations that haven't been able to retain talent, where people actually want to stay and feel like they can show up. I think time will tell, as we see how services are delivered, to make sure that they're delivered in inclusive ways. I'll say actually just to anyone on this call, there's a quote I came across shortly after the George Floyd protest first went national that was something to the effect of showing up as your full self is activism. Because I think several times as we look at different civil rights movements, there's sometimes a challenge to define what it looks like for different people and what it means for you actually to be engaged or not engaged in a different movement. And so for you yourself, just however you define your identity and what it is that makes you uniquely you, show up as your full self in your workplace, and don't feel like you need to apologize for that.
Thanks so much. Could you talk specifically about, I guess, some steps DataKind has done in response as well?
Sure. So DataKind, we put out a statement of solidarity back when people were doing that, I suppose. Honestly, I think we were one of the later organizations to put out that statement publicly. But for me, that was completely fine with me, because the reason why it took us so long to put it out publicly is because we had a lot of internal conversations with the entire organization about what does Black Lives Matter mean to you? What does it mean for us? And so we had lots of conversations with everyone at the company was invited. Most people attended the multiple meetings that we had, where people shared their own experiences, shared what they thought they knew, what they were learning in the time, what they wanted DataKind to do, and what trade-offs we'd be willing to make in our strategic planning in order to be an organization that is more inclusive in our volunteer space and in the organizations we work with and within our company broadly. So that's something that we've done. We also, have an ongoing internal committee on what does DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism mean on an ongoing basis as we continue to look at the way our organization does its work. In our solidarity statement, we also pledged to give away some money to some Black-led organizations, and we are in the process of doing that now. So those are some of the actions we've taken.
Awesome, thank you. I think either second to last or potentially last question from Samya Gupta. Why is there so much emphasis on data analysis to solve problems when in many cases there's a lack of representative data? Do we need to shift emphasis to data collection instead?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think that it really depends on the problem that you're trying to solve. And so I think one, it depends on the problem that you're trying to solve, and two, um, it it's a both and situation. So in some cases, you may have access to a lot of data. There's some, open data sets that are held by, the UN, the World Bank, and other places that have the ability to go out and collect a lot of information. Or some NGOs may have collected, seemingly every single piece of detail on all of their clients, and so have a really rich database of information. And so there really may be more of the analysis rather than the data collection that you need. In other cases, they're just people who are left out of data sets. There's decisions that are left out of data sets, and you really need to focus on the data. I think it's both and, though, because we can't really apply data for good without that analysis. It's also difficult to get people excited about data for good and to do the work and to fund the work if we're saying, well, eventually we might be able to do something around this in a couple of years, but we can't show you anything because we have to spend the next several years collecting data. Which is not to say that you should develop solutions on data that is no good, but can you develop an adjacent solution in a space where you do have access to data that is representative?
Awesome. And very last question. So this is a longer question, so I'll just show the last part of it and read out the whole question. This, let me start over. What are your views on misrepresentation of data? For example, talking about public transportation, a bill in Phoenix was passed which said that the public transport was as expensive as buying a Tesla Model 3 for every resident, while hugely downplaying the positives and the true value of the project. The main question, though, is how do you think we can tackle this problem using data science and handle these adverts when they have huge lobbying power in Congress?
Yeah, this is certainly falls in the category of messy problem. I think that as data scientists, you should make sure, data scientist, anyone in the data for good space, anyone in the tech for good space, you should make sure that you are accurately representing the information that you have found, regardless of where that goes, regardless of what that confirms or denies about your own interest. Sure that I'm thinking of one graph, I think from Georgia put out, maybe it was Georgia or Florida, I can't remember, maybe a month or so ago, in regards to the number of people testing positive for COVID-19. And they had one graph that had, colors about the severity, and then it was a heat map essentially with the number of people who'd been tested. And it was from 3 weeks ago, and then it was from today. And the graph looked essentially the same. But when you looked at the legend, they had changed the number of people for each of those colors. And so the numbers had actually nearly tripled. But if you just looked at the colors, it looked like we've had no change in the past 3 weeks. Imagine that. And so I say that because this interplay, when we're talking public interest technology, of technology and data and what it can do for decision making, is really, really important. This is why we need public interest technologists to really have a seat at the table and to really hold to how do you put this together. The reality of the way our world works, though, is that people pay advertisers and marketers. Some of my best friends are marketers who will try and lobby or pervert that. You just really have to hold true, go through the channels that you have, see what other campaigns you can build, see what other coalitions you can build, and continue to push the information out in the ways you have, just as other people will continue to push the information out in the ways they have.
All right, thank you. I think that's an end to our little Q&A session. Thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in. Thank you, Afua, for speaking to us and agreeing to this. This has been absolutely amazing. Hope all the viewers enjoyed it as much as I did. All right, we'll be back in 2 minutes for our next talk. Bye-bye.
All right. Can everybody hear me well? I hope so. Thank you all for, taking the time to stick with us throughout the whole day. Happy Saturday or Sunday, depending on where you're at right now. I know some people joined the IBM workshop this morning, and it was around 8 p.m. over there for you. So if you're still with us, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Joining us shortly is Rosanna Durruthy. Rosanna, if you'd like to join, I'll add you to the stream right now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world.
Right. Yeah. Rosanna Durruthy is LinkedIn's Vice President and Head of Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, where she leads LinkedIn's diversity strategy, beating industry averages and growing female representation. In addition to her role at LinkedIn, Rosanna is also a member of the Business Advisory Council of the Human Rights Campaign, where she provides expertise and counsel on LGBTQ workplace issues. She has also been recognized as one of the country's leading professional Hispanic women and an influential mind in the diversity and inclusion space. Rosanna, thanks for coming. Would you like to take it away?
Alvin, it's really a privilege to be here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time. I know it's Saturday, probably a lot that you'd like to be up to, and hopefully this has been one of the best investments of your time in quite a while. As Elvin shared with you, I'm Rosanna Durruthy. I've been at LinkedIn for the last 3 years, leading diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and working to really bring the access to the company's vision of creating economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. But I'll tell you, one of the things that for me has been so humbling about this work of diversity, inclusion, and belonging is seeing how far we've come and how far we have to go. Obviously, we're living in pretty unprecedented times. And the one thing that stands out for me when I think about this particular moment is that whether an individual is highly experienced and accomplished and 65 years old, or at the beginning of their lives and career journey in their teens, thinking about college or a career or future, there is no distinct advantage in how to approach the future. We're dealing with pretty unprecedented times. And for me, what that inspires is this moment where we get to create what the future is going to look like. We get to create the new rules of how we treat each other and how we navigate the world. And it reminds me very much of my own journey. And so, as I spoke to Elvin in preparation for today, I thought I'd share a little bit about my own background. And some of you may find resonance in this. You might find that our stories have similarities and our stories have great differences. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised to a Puerto Rican mom and a Cuban dad. Spanish is my first language, and very proudly so. I went to New York City public schools, and in that domain of education, I went to public schools in the South Bronx and in Queens, New York, and had the experience often of being the other one or the only one, depending upon how you look at the circumstances, in part because of my own motivation around academics and being someone who is hungry for curiosity and learning, and fortunate to have a lot of that in my home. Forgive my dog, she's having a little bit of a coughing attack here. Sorry, let me grab her. Come here, Harley. Yes, she wants to get in on the day. But also because in the journey from my own youth through education and my aspirations, like some of you, I had big dreams, big ideals around how I wanted to change the world. And while I was in public school, I knew that I wanted to go to a good college. I knew that I wanted to have a good career. And I knew that I wanted to make a difference in the world. And I was fortunate to graduate from high school at 16, to go to Harvard. And yet by 17, I was on leave of absence from Harvard. I am officially and technically a Harvard dropout and get to share that with Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, even though I don't have a bank account like them. And what I also recognized was in that moment, we can all have tremendous promise, but life is going to happen. And, what happened isn't what we expect or what we planned for. I had the experience of becoming homeless at a young age and spending time trying to just survive, counting pennies for meals, sleeping at friends' homes, to have a roof over my head with my mom. And it took a couple of years. And in that process, I recognized something that has served me well throughout my life and career. We experience the unexpected. There isn't a planning for it. I don't even know that there's such a thing as being ready for it. There's just a going through it and surviving it. But in the process of surviving, there are things we tell ourselves about that moment. We may ask, why is this happening to me? We may ask, why do things like this happen in the world? We may even be asking, what is it that requires so much of me to figure it out for myself? Why can't it just be easier? And those questions don't necessarily make a huge difference. The answer often does, however. The conclusions that we form about ourselves and whether we're worthy, the conclusion about whether we're ready or up to it or good enough, the conclusions about what we think society may think about us or not. All those things are the determinants of what the future holds. And what I realized then, and I live by now, is that we are never our circumstances. No matter how great the circumstance or how poor or dire the circumstance, we're not our circumstances. Who we are is the possibility of the things that we aspire to be and the dreams we aspire to be, and how we conduct ourselves here and now is a major determinant in how we begin to get ahead. And I was really fortunate. I, didn't have my college degree, but the things that I did well, I knew I did well. I knew I communicated effectively. I knew that I was a good listener. I knew that I was a good writer. And for many of you, I think you may too experience the struggle, whether the struggle comes from socioeconomic circumstances, whether the struggle comes from concerns or considerations around our own families and their well-being. And sometimes the struggle is even the question of, is it okay for me to move ahead when my family is just trying to make ends meet? Is it okay for me to aspire and dream to do more when I could be the extra pair of hands that helps out the family? And no one can make those decisions for us. But a question that I think we do have to ask ourselves is, if I stop now, if I give up now, if I give into circumstance and become the circumstance, will I in fact win? Will I win for myself? Will I win for my family? Or will I just be surviving along the way? And I think we all have to ask ourselves that question, because I genuinely believe each and every one of us has magical capabilities and talents. I think when our talents combine with the talents of other people, we create alchemy. We see that in some people who are inventors. We see that in entrepreneurs. We see that in people like my good friend Tim Salau, who I know Elvin got to spend time with yesterday in a fireside chat. We see people starting up businesses and creating solutions that only we understand and we know will make a difference, because we come from places and communities and families where those solutions can make a difference for us. And if we don't build it, if we don't do it, who will? If we don't care, who's going to care more? And if we don't believe in ourselves, who's going to believe in us? And so this thing called imposter syndrome can be real. We ask ourselves, who am I? And my question is, why wouldn't you be? Why wouldn't you be the one? Why wouldn't you be the person who creates the answers that we're waiting for? Why wouldn't you be the one to give hope to another individual? Why wouldn't you be the one who illuminates possibility for your family and for your community? And that's really the basis of any career, any work. Whether you choose to be an engineer, or you choose to go into medicine, or you choose to be a business person, all of that is relevant. And what's most relevant is who you're going to be for yourself, for the people you care about, for the things that matter to you. And it's in that determination, it's in that get up and go, it's in that not giving up, that new things emerge and new potential is created. One of the things that I also learned early on, as I shared with you, I'm Cuban and Puerto Rican, I'm a Black woman, I'm also a lesbian woman. And it was very provocative to walk the early part of my life, recognizing that the narrative about being a person of color automatically makes determinations about how far we can get. And I was fortunate. My mom always believed in me, so she always told me I can do it. If anyone could do it, I could do it. And that certainly gave me a decided advantage in life. It also dawned on me when I realized that I was gay, that there were other things that I was totally unaware of, like how the world responds to the person I am that they can't see. Do I succeed by pretending, or do I succeed by being my authentic self? Do I hide who I am in order to get out of the circumstances that I was living under? And we all have some version of that we deal with. You know, my imposter syndrome around can I make it and am I really good enough to make it was dancing with my covering experience of, you know, it's okay. People obviously know that I'm Black, and when I speak Spanish and I tell people I'm Latina, they obviously know that. And it was evident to many at the time that I was female. It wasn't necessarily as evident that I was a lesbian. And as I grew and as I matured and as I experienced success professionally, I recognized the world has lots of stories about who we are based on what they know about us. And there's real power in creating our own story. As I grew successfully in my career, I had to make determinations about whether I was going to turn up as Rosanna or whether I was going to turn up as some version of somebody else in order to please the world. And I think those are conversations we have with ourselves, and we need to be able to address with ourselves, recognizing that there comes a moment where our own inauthenticity, our own manner of lying about who we are, actually gets in the way of our being successful and happy. And I make the distinction because if you're successful and you're not happy, I would assert you haven't accomplished very much in life. In fact, if you can't be fulfilled in the being that you are, you're going to miss out on joy. You're going to miss out on waking up to a day where you feel like you're making a difference. You're going to miss out on the amazing relationships you can have and the people that you'll meet and the ways in which you'll touch and inspire their lives. And so, you know, this process of growing up and this process of finding success and this process of being a leader is largely a process of falling in love with ourselves, of believing in ourselves, of feeling that we not only can make a difference for ourselves, but we can make a difference for the world we care about, for the communities we care about. And in this set of life lessons that I've embarked on and I'm sharing with you, it always humbles me to think that at any given moment, we could crawl under the covers and imagine we'd be better off just disappearing. In the era of COVID, I know that times are really hard. And every day I wake up with a heavy heart thinking that there are people who are waking up with food insecurity and worried about whether they're going to be able to keep their homes and have a roof over their head, and worried about their education. And what I'm optimistic about, and I think you're such an important part of this optimism, is that the future isn't something that just happens. The future is something that's created. It's created by the people who stand up and lead. They don't lead by title. They don't even lead by election or appointment. They lead by sheer self-determination. They lead by moments like these and sessions like these where you inventory what it is that you want to accomplish in life. And you think about who you're going to be for yourself, for your community, for your family, for the world. And you think about the ways in which you prove yourself every day. You get up, you go to school, you know, there may be challenges, but your life is a symbol of all the challenges you've overcome. You know, my life is a symbol of all the challenges I've had to overcome. And that's inspiring. I think when we look at who we are in this very moment, striving for a better future, sharing with each other, collaborating in a way where we want to learn from each other and create something more and create a more equitable world and create a world where people who haven't had opportunity not only have opportunity, but they realize their potential in those opportunities. You're an important part of that equation. You're going to be an important part of the narrative that gets told around this future. And so 3 things that I want each of you to know. If you think that the world doesn't believe in you, you're mistaken. I don't know who the world is. I know I believe in you. I know Elvin believes in you. I know that this word called impact is about the creation of power, and it's the power that you have to make a difference in the world. Second, you can take your imposter syndrome and put it in your back pocket. It's going to be with you. You're going to wake up some days and fear failure, and that's okay. And some days you may even fail, and that's even better because you're going to learn from that. And failure is a sign that we survived what happened, and what we learn from the failure is what makes us ultimately more successful. So don't be afraid of failure. Don't be afraid of the word or the experiences, because they can enrich you. And even when you fail, you are never a failure, because you are never your circumstances. And last, when I think about the identities that I inhabit and how I've walked this earth, it sometimes feels shameful to feel that I've covered, that I've had that moment when I've chosen one identity over the other because I felt it would make it easier, because people would be more accepting of me. But the biggest lesson that I've learned from that is that it's not my being Latina versus Black versus female versus lesbian, because you can't choose one over the other. You just are who you are. And when you show up whole and complete, the world sees you. And when you start picking identities, you second guess yourself. And I had that time when I second guessed myself. I think we all have a lot of work to do personally to reconcile the ways in which we feel shame, or the ways in which we feel that if we hide something about ourselves, it makes us more acceptable to the world. But until we reckon with and we acknowledge who we are and we accept ourselves completely, the world can never accept us. The world can never know who we are or what we're capable of. The history that we read about will continue to speak narratives about people who wrote the stories, and they will write people out of those narratives who are critical to those stories, who were the stories, who were the inventors, and the people who fought for freedom, and the people who created wealth, and the people who made it possible for a democracy to exist. And it's up to us to write the next chapter. It's up to us to be powerful in who we are, to learn every day, and to recognize that our learning isn't going to be about the degree we get, and it's really important to have that degree. Our learning is going to be about how we take what we've learned and we apply it to create a new reality for all of us. One that's equitable, one where we thrive, and one where our communities have the hope and the power to thrive themselves. So I'm excited about the future. I'm excited about you. I'm excited about what you will create, because leaders make things happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And I sincerely believe each of you is a leader, and it's a privilege to get to stand with you. So Elvin, I think it's an opportunity for us to get into a little bit of a conversation.
Yeah, you left me speechless. I don't know what to say, but just like Larissa mentioned earlier, if you're at your computer, please give a round of applause, a virtual round of applause. The chat is definitely showing you love from around the world. So I guess I'll start with my first question. As you mentioned, our friend Tim, he had a chat yesterday with us, and he talked about the importance of vulnerability with respect to authenticity, and you touched on both of those. Something that really I think that we definitely both share, is you and I both grew up homeless. So homelessness is a very unique and humbling experience that a lot of people, fortunately, don't have to experience in their lifetime, right? So you also mentioned sharing. What is something that being homeless taught you that you'd like to share with our community?
I think first you try to hide it because you think the world has a particular view of what it is to be homeless. And then what I learned, the power of sharing it was that I let go of the shame. I mean, the power of sharing it was recognizing that the homelessness was also an important part of my own resilience, of my understanding how to navigate moments and, the power of getting through uncertainty. And this is a moment right now where we're all in a universal world of uncertainty. I think, when you wake up in the morning and you're not quite sure where you'll sleep that night, or, when you don't have enough money for a meal and you're crawling on the floor looking for pennies, there is a sense of like everything you find is gold. And I think we live in a world where all too frequently the portrayals, whether it's in the media or in the news, is that you have to have in order to be powerful or valuable or heard. The reality is none of that is true. You can have nothing, you can come from nothing and be powerful and amazing, because in fact, we can create from nothing. We don't, people often think when I am rich, then I can have a great house and then I can be happy. No, happiness isn't based upon all those things. Happiness is a choice we make in life. And it begins with, can I be happy with who I am? Am I someone who brings, honor and respect and love and kindness to other people? And from that, you can create a lot. You create relationships which lend to opportunities. You can create knowledge from the circumstance and share that knowledge with others. You can inspire hope where people may feel there isn't hope. You can be a possibility for someone who looks up to you, and you can be a possibility for someone who needs you. And so, I think what I learned, and it took me a long time to share, that story, was sharing empowers me to empower others. Sharing is not about our lives come perfectly wrapped with this beautiful bow. It all works out and we have a happy ending. In fact, life is all of the moments that are happening right now. It's not where you get to at some point in the future. And that was a huge lesson. I had watched a lot of movies as a kid, and so everything seemed to end with a happy ending, and you start to think that life is supposed to be a certain way. And I think the real gift is that life is exactly as it is, and we have to deal with it now, and now, and now. And everything that's ever happened to us is so important in building the fabric and the formula of who we'll be in the future. It doesn't determine who we are. It's an input into who we can be. It's not a determinant of who we get to be. And I think we often don't hear that, and we don't think that. And if we're reading stories in the media, what we're reading is, what we read about are determinations that are made about us not knowing who we are. And sometimes we don't even know who we are, and we buy into those stories. So, I learned in my first and only semester at Harvard, don't believe everything you read, because you too can write a book. And that was sobering. It was really sobering, because I thought, wow, I don't know a lot, but I can write a book. And some people are going to believe that, and some people are going to imagine these things are true or facts or not facts. A lot of what we see in the media today has nothing to do with facts or truth. And so we have to determine how much of that we're going to consume and how much of that we're actually going to operate from. And there is distinctly a power that comes from who we choose to be versus what our defaults might be. I know that I operate differently in the world when I'm angry or upset or resentful or scared from who I get to be when I feel confident, when I feel at ease, when I feel like, okay, this is just a moment. And coming from that really provides so much more. So whatever it is you think you have to hide in life, I would challenge the notion, because the moment we hide things big or small, we start hiding those parts of ourselves that may give us power.
Yeah. For me, I can definitely relate. I remember the shelter that I was living in after being homeless is called Mujeres Unidas. So if anybody wants to donate to Mujeres Unidas. But Anyway, yeah, for me, it was something that I had covered up for many years until it was my time to graduate from high school. And I realized that throughout that time, I had just begun to normalize it, and it just became a part of me. And I didn't realize that it wasn't something that people, don't really go through. And it wasn't until the college essays that I stopped covering it, and stopped just trying to hide from it, and just became more open and vulnerable about it. And then from that, just became happier with all of it. So yeah, thank you so much. We have a question, actually. How did you learn how to communicate like this?
Gosh, that's a really great question. I wish I knew exactly what the formula was. I can tell you what the inputs were. From an early age, my mom answered every question I ever had. She started teaching me to read long before pre-K age. On Sundays, our Sunday dinners, when I was really young, consisted of discussing what was going on in the world. And by the time I was in elementary school, we would each get a section of the newspaper, and part of dinner would be discussing the section we read. My parents used to get the New York Times and the Daily News. And so it was everything from reading comics to the Metro section in the New York Times to what was in the Daily News, the sports pages, particularly in the Daily News. But all of that, I think, lent to this sense of feeling confident enough to express myself and to ask questions. And so my communication skills began at a very early age. And my mom and my dad worked together, and they would take me to the office, and in doing so would let me answer the phones on a Saturday when patients called the office, and would teach me how to file, back then, index cards, something that would be non-existent today as everything is digital. But it was really an opportunity to accelerate my learning and to see that I could do things even at the age of 6, 7, 8 years of age. So I was really fortunate that this thing I do in communicating was stoked at such an early age. It has been the one constant, and it's what made it possible for me to get my first job when I had no other credential and no other experience. It's also been beneficial in that I've learned the power of words. And I encourage everyone who's watching to think about the words you use, whether it's the words you use to describe yourself, your circumstances, your aspirations, every and, every but, everything we use to define who we are or what we're going through, because our words are really powerful. And I believe that how we frame ideas and how we convey our thoughts really determines not only how we view our circumstances, but how people begin to see us either as a solution to the circumstance or a part of the circumstance or a part of the future even. And so I was really fortunate early on, but I think communication is something we can teach ourselves. I read a lot. I still read a lot. I listen to podcasts. I listen to music all the time. I like the old world and the new world. So history and mythology are things that fire up my imagination. Debating about things has definitely helped me communicate. It's not good enough to talk to people who believe in the same things I believe in. And particularly in this work I lead around diversity, inclusion, and belonging, you have to be able to stand in the space of someone who doesn't believe in the things you believe in, to understand what drives their beliefs and their ideas, not only to debate those ideas, but to bridge those ideas, to build solutions, because a world of right or wrong only leaves people standing on opposite sides. You can't build together in opposition. You can only build together from seeing that our different ideas can yield new ways of navigating and creating together.
Thank you. Kind of a aside, but when do you plan on running for office, and do you need a campaign manager?
That's a little bit of a cosmic joke. I'm not planning on running for office, but I thank you for that that question, Sarah, but if you choose to run for office, reach out to me. I always like to be behind the scenes. Glad to be an advisor, glad to support your campaign.
So Angelica says, what are some moments in your journey of falling in love with yourself that have led you to where you are today?
So that's an awesome question. I would say there have been moments that have surprised me. So early on, I was raised Catholic, and I call myself a recovering Catholic today. And I always had this question of God. And my question of God was, if you've created all of us, haven't you created us with the same sense of perfection, regardless of all the things by which human beings judge each other by? And in those discussions of understanding, believing that God truly loves all of his, her, their children, what I recognized was I really am perfect just as I am. There isn't a I should have been, could have been, would have been. There is just me. And there is the person that I get to choose to be in my everyday. And falling in love with myself was really recognizing that that being a powerful human isn't about being a perfect human. It's about being a willing human. It's about the willingness to learn. It's about the willingness to understand. And it's about seeing my flaws and seeing my strengths and being like, okay, I got that. And there's some things I want to be better at. And I've practiced and learned to be better at those things. And there are some things I'm really not good at, and I'm not interested in addressing them. And, this falling in love has to happen ongoingly, because as human beings, we have short memories sometimes. So, it's not unusual that we get caught up in the, I'm not, am I good enough for this circumstance or this situation? Am I doing the right things? Am I going to fail? And sometimes measuring this sense of worth by our successes versus our failures, which I think is an entirely false premise. I think our successes come from those moments when we acknowledge reality and we share with others and we help others and we care about others. And from that, I learn, I gain the ability to be more powerful. I become more resourceful, and I let others help me as well. And so falling in love with myself is about what are the things I do that allow others to see their own power and to see what's possible for themselves. And when I do that, it gives me a sense of this is where I get to make a difference in the world. It may not be a major invention. I might not change the existing state of the world, but if one person can see possibility and hope, then we're experiencing love. That's the love I can have for myself, and that's the love I can help that person experience as well for themselves.
Thank you. So this is a two-part, a lead-in from a previous statement. But Samia says that some days I feel like I'm not doing enough, even though I'm trying my hardest. There's this sort of long-term patience that I had to accept. From what you've described so far, I'm convinced that you understand this feeling well. Can you speak on this?
Gosh. There's always a sense of wanting to do more or be more. And I think that is the machinery we inhabit as humans. I think being human is very much recognizing that we are like machines, that there is an externality that has defined what success should look like or should be. It has defined what we get to do and when we get to do it and who gets invited and who is permitted and who has the authority. But none of those things really are true. We've just bought into the script. And invariably, we measure ourselves against something on the outside. But if we stand in that moment of quiet, in that moment perhaps when we meditate, and we look at how far we've come, and we look at where we're going, because we're always at the bottom of the mountain, in my estimation. Even when we get to the top, you get right back to the bottom to start all over again. And it's not a relativity based on, making it, getting there and making it. For as long as we live, we are constantly striving. And that continuous journey is embodied in our growth mindsets, a recognition that what made us successful today may not be relevant 20 years from now, the position I hold today didn't exist when I was in school. So for many of you who are teenagers, headline here, whatever you're studying is going to change. If you change your mind, decide you want to study something else, decide that you want to explore or create your own curriculum, go for it. Because the reality is the world continues to change, and what we do today, what we say is critical and important today, continues to change. And that's called technology. It's the technology not only in the laptop or the phone that you have, it's the technology in life that continues to change. And so to the extent that we continue growing and developing, we're always going to have a measuring stick that seems to hold us a little shorter than where we think we should be. So, you know, Samia, I invite you to consider you are perfect, whole, and complete just as you are. And what you're doing is continuing to build into the future. And there's nothing wrong with where we are. There's nothing wrong with the moment where we're experiencing failure. If we need to feel that, if we need to cry, go for it. Just don't stay there. You know, give yourself a time, you know, to do it, and then get out of it and move into the next space, because it's in that next space that we can do some really amazing work and we begin to realize our hopes and our dreams and our aspirations.
So Tassina says, has there been any instances when you felt uncomfortable bringing your whole authentic self to work? Any advice for those who are experiencing such environments or circumstances, especially probably in your role?
Absolutely. You know, I think we all have that little voice in our heads that asks the question, should I say it? You know, should I own this or admit to it? And I'll tell you an important moment for me. In some ways, it's given the power for what I do in my life. The first Chief Diversity Officer role I stepped into was 20 years ago. And in the offer to be a Chief Diversity Officer, even as I interviewed, it struck me, there are a lot of people who think, well, you're well suited to do this work as a woman of color, as a Latina woman, you understand what's going on, but I wasn't out at work. In fact, I had, you know, lots of thoughts and notions and had received advice, you know, from people who cared about me and loved me and the world that said, there are some things the work doesn't need to know about you. There are some things you don't bring to work. But it also dawned on me that the time and space that we give to hiding ourselves is like tying up emotional real estate. You know, on Monday mornings, I would get to work. Back in the day when you actually went to work and there were still things like water coolers, and people would be in water cooler conversations about their lives and their relationships and what they had done on the weekend. I would never share that I had been at a club, much less a gay club, over the weekend. Or if I did, you know, I was covering all the pronouns so that I wouldn't trip up and reveal myself to be gay. I had notions that people who liked me and accepted me might not accept me if they knew that I was gay. And in fact, I had a really good friend that when I came out to her, she was so insulted that I hadn't come out to her beforehand that actually was what harmed our relationship more than anything else. And I understand now why she felt that way, because she felt, if I'm a good friend, why wouldn't you share who you are? But on the other side of it, I also think it's a little self-serving for people to feel offended that you haven't shared something with them that you know the world will judge you by. And so she was revealing her own sense of judgment in that moment. Just saying, don't want to be too judgmental here. We're good friends now again. But, you know, the learning is bringing your whole authentic self to work isn't without risk. But owning that risk allowed me to feel not only confident in how I could be myself, it opened up all sorts of emotional real estate where I could think about not only the work I was doing, but all sorts of other things that brought value to my work. If you imagine for a moment that you get hired to do a job and the only thing you do is that job and people don't know who you are, after a while you become invisible. You're kind of like the furniture in the space. You're always there. Chairs are necessary, desks are necessary, tables are necessary. But do we give a lot of thought to the chair or to the table that enables us to be more productive? Reality is we don't. I would say the same thing happens with human beings. When you are just the work and not the person who walks into the environment or into the conversation, people don't get to know you, and they just assume that you're the work that's being done. You become a utility. You are a functionality. You are not a human being. You're not a possibility. And I think some of the challenges that we're dealing today with relation to systemic racism is really about how the system has made many of us as people of color a thing, not a human being. We're not treated as whole and complete. And the system has made it possible for us to second guess whether we can even be whole and complete at work. Most people, and I would say in a system that is highly regulated by race, if you are a person in the majority, if you're white in America, you don't always have to think about those things. In fact, you probably don't. And yet, if you're a person of color, this has been a conversation in all of our lives, whether it's, just how Latina I appear, or how Black I appear, or how in much of my life people have questioned where I got my accent from. I grew up in Flushing, Queens. People often relate Flushing, Queens to The Nanny, old sitcom from before many of you were born, I'm sure, but people with heavy accents. And yet I have friends still who went to school with me who have that accent. I never had it. Maybe it's a function of Spanish being my first language and having a Puerto Rican mom and a Cuban dad. Maybe it's a function of diction and the dictionary and this idea of if I had a question about a word and what it meant and how it should be pronounced, go to the dictionary. So my favorite book growing up was the dictionary. And diction became a thing for me. And so being ourselves is not only a gift to ourselves, it's a gift to the environment and to the people we're a part of. It's not without risk. But I would actually say, if you can't be yourself in the environment you're in, then that environment doesn't deserve you. Because what I do for a living is not only about welcoming diversity and inclusion in the environment and creating it, it's also about creating belonging. And when we belong, we unleash this amazing force, our own superhuman and superhero powers, because we bring our experiences and our care and our motivation and our aspiration and our desires not only into the room, but to the work we do. If we're just doing the work and we're hiding ourselves, we don't bring all of that. We don't unlock our discretionary talents. We don't bring our discretionary potential to the table. We're just the job. And that is, at least for me, a really less than fulfilling life to live. And I'm not particularly given to mediocrity. So I don't want to live a mediocre life. I want to live a powerful one. And that means I've got to stand firmly in my shoes.
Thank you, Rosanna. I think that's a good segue into this question Wendy has. Do you have any tips for female students going into a male-dominated workspace? Any stories, advice?
Wendy, thanks for that question. Yes, I am a product of a person who early in her career strove to wear suits that hid who I was. And what I would say is it's really important for you to embrace yourself in whatever way that self manifests and shows up. I don't think that our world, given that it certainly has a balanced representation of men, women, and quite frankly, people who may not conform to this binary way of relating in the world, I don't think there's space any longer for this idea that you've got to be a guy, a man, to operate in the environment. So really important to think about as a woman where your power stems from. And when you go into environments, and technology is a really great space, women in technology are immensely talented. And I think all too frequently we forget the role women have played in the world of technology. For those of you who haven't seen the movie Hidden Figures, just a quick shout out. Margot Lee Shetterly, who wrote the book, was a woman I met 25 years ago when she was an associate in investment banking. And I didn't know this powerful story about, her own aunt, who was one of the women in Hidden Figures. And, I think we've allowed people to tell us where we belong far too frequently. I think as a woman in a male-dominated workspace, first, know that you belong. Whatever people do to make you feel less than or ignore you or make fun of you, if they do that, don't even second guess it. Second, find your allies. You know, there are a lot of really great guys who want to be allies, who are willing to have you in their study groups, who want to learn from you too. You know, the power to create relationships makes it possible for us to have our own community and in fact have our own tribe that supports us. And a world of only women or only men won't work. I really believe that. I think we create amazing solutions together. And then the last thing I would say to you, the one story I'll share with you is I was a tomboy growing up. And in many ways that probably worked to my advantage. You know, I was such a tomboy that when I was in the 7th grade, going into 7th grade, I went to summer camp, and the camp director happened to be my gym teacher from elementary school, who knew just how athletic I was and how competitive I was and how given I was to winning. And rather than assigning me to the girls group that corresponded with my age, he made me a counselor in training for the boys group. Our first week in camp, we played softball. There were 14 of us. I was placed 13th in the batting order. The first day we played, I had a couple of hits and got moved to 5th in the batting order, which in a batting order of 14 is a pretty good space to be in. And I was the only girl on the team. And it was in that early moment that it allowed me to see, I don't necessarily have the same size as the guys. I may not be as big or as fast as some of the guys, but I know that there are things I do really well. Focus on the things you do well. Find the people who appreciate your talents and surround yourself with them. And don't be afraid to ask, because sometimes we stop ourselves based on what we imagine, not based on what's real. And so the guys who don't talk to you, it may not be that they're seeking to ignore you or that they don't care. They just don't even realize that you would want to be a part of their group. So sometimes we have to ask and invite ourselves into the room. If you have the abilities, if you have the motivation, if you have the attitude, you'll develop the skills. You're going to be competitive, and they're going to learn from you as much as we may learn from them. More than anything, I think they learn from us. And that's the power of creating new relationships, expanding our networks, and being the person in someone's world who's different from them that allows them to be more effective in the world. Because sameness isn't what creates magic. Difference is what creates magic.
Thank you for that. And I guess, you know, if you had one word, it seems like you really like alchemy and magic, but if you had one word that best sums you and your vision, what would it be?
It probably would be my own Twitter handle, Talent Alchemist. It's about realizing our potential through our talents, but recognizing that talent is this very mutable material. It's a raw matter that continues to be polished and continues to evolve and to grow. And it transforms in the space of others. It transforms with the talent of others. So Talent Alchemist would be my word.
Right.
Or 2 words, really.
So how do you suggest we deal with imposter syndrome from time to time? I know you touched on that, but I guess in general, how do we tailor to these in our circumstances?
I think as human beings, compassion is a really powerful skill, and we begin by sharing that compassion with ourselves. I think when we submit to imposter syndrome, we're usually not saying kind things to ourselves about who we are. We're not only doubting ourselves, we're assuming others are saying things about us that they probably aren't saying, and even if they said them, it doesn't really matter. And so the ability to be compassionate with ourselves, to let go of the language, the talk track, the voice in our head, to sometimes thank that voice in our head, because sometimes that sense of being an imposter is really designed to protect us from the things that we fear. We fear failing, we fear embarrassment, we fear humiliation. but it's often made up. It's presuming something that hasn't occurred, and it's presuming something that even if it's occurred, it already happened. So what difference would it make? And so the compassion that we can hold for ourselves is to say, thank you, voice, for wanting to protect me. I heard you. And then you set it aside and do it anyhow.
So I know we have about 12 more minutes. We still have a lot of questions. So I'm going to jump around a little bit and try and get to everybody's. I really like this one. How do you deal with suggestions that the reason you have got in your position is because of your gender, your race, etc., identity, things that you can't control rather than your skills and character?
Yeah, so Bhuvni, one of the things I'm going to say to you is that this is where my mom probably built my confidence up really well. I know that I am uniquely one of a kind, and whether I was hired because of my gender or my race, the outcome and productivity that I brought to the roles I've been in have been uniquely produced by me, and I would say I've delivered great results along the way. I don't worry a lot. I think my gender, my race are relevant. I think my perspective is valuable, and I don't live only in my perspective. In fact, one of the things that I feel is not only a responsibility of a leader and an inclusive leader, but is necessitated, is that I'm someone who can help channel other voices, other perspectives, other ideas. So if my packaging is what has contributed to the level of self-awareness and the level of care to be an inclusive leader that allows others to be expressed and to be heard, I'll wear this package every day of the week. I'm pretty happy with it. And I'm thankful that having these experiences has allowed me to be more compassionate about the experiences of others who often are voiceless, who aren't invited, who don't get opportunities. I've always felt a responsibility to be someone who amplifies others and opens the door for others. And so I recognize I don't know that I would have been that person if I would have been born differently. So it's pretty true, and I'm okay with that.
So I think this is a good segue to, what do most companies get wrong about diversity and inclusion work? How can employees hold their companies accountable to do more than just performative allyship?
So I love that question, because I think this is the lesson that leaders are learning today. Diversity and inclusion isn't done by an office or a team or a person of color. It is everyone's work. It is the work of leaders. It is the work of really maximizing the potential and the effect of having amazing talent in the environment. Diversity and inclusion, and in my case, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, has demonstrated immense impact, positive impact on the bottom line. And it's also demonstrated that not everyone can do it. And so even research that any of us may embark on around D&I will show, if you're looking at McKinsey studies or Deloitte studies, that companies that have more diverse leadership team, both diversity in women as well as diversity in race and ethnicity, outperform on revenue, outperform in income, and performance and productivity are critical. But there's also research that tells us that homogeneous teams versus heterogeneous teams have a curve of performance. And in that performance curve, it's equally possible for a heterogeneous team to underperform as it is to outperform in the area of creativity and innovation. And the reason for that isn't that people on the team are different. The reason for that is that the leader of the team who fears differences tends to minimize those differences, will focus on treating everyone the same, expects everyone to do the same things despite the fact that we come from very different lives, circumstances, situations. We may be single, we may be younger, we may be older, we may be parents, we may be caregivers, we may be disabled, we may be gay. There are any number of things that have an influence on our lives. But the leaders who understand that different talents, abilities, and perspectives actually can create a powerful asset for the team. It actually makes the whole bigger, more effective, more complete, are the teams that outperform. And they outperform with consistency, and they create differentiated results and outcomes. So what leaders are learning is that sameness creates a predictability called underperformance. And if some of you look at companies that were the Fortune 500 companies of a decade ago, what you may see is that some of those companies are no longer the highest performing companies. If you go back 20, 25, 30 years to the beginning of my career, some of those companies don't even exist. In fact, I work for a company that 20 years ago was a Fortune 100 company, and it no longer exists. So difference is actually the inflection point for creating not only new solutions, but providing new services and ultimately creating trust. And leaders have learned that without trust, you can't inspire your employees, you can't motivate them, you can't build your consumer market, you don't create solutions for that market, and you're not going to be trusted by your consumers. So in the work that I do and with the kinds of leaders that I get to work with, what increasingly we're seeing is leaders recognize the ability to lead diversity, inclusion, and belonging is not only a game changer and a performance changer, but because it's still not taught in schools, it's still not taught in businesses, we have a responsibility to help people gain those skills, because without those skills, they will underperform and their teams are going to underperform over time. And with relation to accountability, one more thing, I realize I didn't answer in Sarah's question. I think companies have to understand how their culture allows for accountability or gets in the way of accountability. And I say that because I'm not the person who necessarily believes you pay someone for representation in headcount. I believe that it's a part of everyone's performance to demonstrate the ways in which they behave inclusively. So when I look at how leaders are compensated, yes, performance outcomes are important, but leaders should be creating other leaders. Who are the leaders you're developing? Who are you mentoring? Who are you sponsoring in the work environment? And for that, you should be rewarded and compensated and recognized for your leadership skill, because if you are not sponsoring and developing diverse talent, if you're only sponsoring people who grow and show up in your own image, then what you're doing is compromising the capabilities of your organization to be able to generate the leadership it needs for the future. And so increasingly, we're seeing that companies are recognizing that needs to be an important accountability. I think employees hold their leaders accountable by asking questions, as our own employees do, by expecting transparency. So if this is a goal for an organization, then we need to treat it like any other business goal. How are we talking about it in our all hands? How are we sharing information on how we're progressing, not only in an annual diversity report, but how is my immediate functional leader sharing that information with me as well, so that I understand what my accountability is, and that we're all held to a standard of expectation around how we're contributing to those outcomes, and not expecting just those who volunteer to be involved with employee resource groups or doing the work of recruiting diverse talent are the people who are moving us in that direction, but how is everyone moving us in that direction? And that's where I think we begin to suspend this idea of performative allyship to make it performance-based allyship.
I have one last question that I want to ask you. I think it's a good way to conclude the question portion. If you could say or change anything to, I guess, your younger self, what would you say or change?
The first thing I would say is it took me a while to accept myself and love myself. I struggled when I was younger with, notions of suicide. I worried that I wasn't good enough. I was worried that I would disappoint my parents, my mom especially. I struggled with coming out and feeling that I could be myself, because I felt like I would disappoint my family. So what I would say to my younger Rosanna, what I would say to any of you, is don't be afraid of the things that make you happy and allow you to be more of yourself. Don't be afraid to explore and learn who you are and then stand firmly in being that person. I wouldn't have accomplished the things I've accomplished, the ability to influence in the world and to be someone who can speak things into existence. Like, I really get that what I do today is special because it hasn't existed in the past. So I'm creating something that hasn't existed. You will all help me create that as well. But if I'm afraid to be myself, the fear casts a bigger shadow on the future we can create than the power to be that, to live that, to embody that, and to inspire that. So that's what I would say to my younger self. Be yourself and know that who you are is perfect, whole, and complete, just as you are.
Be yourself. Rosanna, it's both a blessing and a privilege, honestly, to engage in conversation with you. I'm sure the audience and our community really liked you imparting your wisdom and alchemy with us. Thank you so much for helping us fall deeper in love with ourselves. We're perfect, we're whole, we're complete just as we are, and there's nothing at all that's wrong with us. We feel, and being ourselves is a gift to not only ourselves, but also the environment around us. And like you said, it's everyone's work to contribute to diversity, inclusion, and belonging in our lifetime so that the lives after us realize what we aspire to see in the future. So, Rosanna, thank you so much.
Thank you,
It's been
Elvin.
great. It's been great. I think this is a good segue to bring Aaron back on to a great way to kick off the TED Talk that we're having after this. So, Rosanna, thank you so much again.
See you guys.
Wow, Rosanna, that was fabulous. That was such an amazing talk. Highlight of the summit so far for me. Now we're going to be transitioning into a very special part of this year's programming. We figured, we got so many amazing registrants and so many talented folks who are joining the Impact Summit, and so we decided to showcase some of their passions and talents and enthusiasm. And so many of the Impact Summiteers who are attending virtually are leading their own miniature TED Talks, we call them. So if you're in the Slack, which you can join at impactlabs.io/Slack, you can sign up and you can see the current schedule of what the talks are being presented on right now. We have 3 talks happening every half hour. Christine is going to be leading a talk on decision paralysis. Neha is going to be talking about rubber duckies, Spider-Man, and stand-up comedy. Very curious to hear what that one is. And Austin is going to be giving a wake-up call on the climate crisis at an individual level. So you could join those links in the Slack, and we'll see you there for these group discussions. And there's going to be another mini TED Talk every half hour for the next 2 hours. Again, we're really so happy to have Rosanna and to have Afua and Renee and all of our fabulous speakers so far. This has been an amazing weekend. I've been learning so much. And thank you to our co-hosts, Elvin and Larissa and Christina and Samya and Alex and just everyone who's just been so fabulous. It's just been a joy to work with you all. So love you, and we're signing off for now, and we'll see you in these mini